efficiencies, and it resulted in overall findings, less overall findings. And it doesn't matter which area of the country you were in, you can see that FY21 produced far fewer findings in either the TR process or the SMR process. Now, if you're just a rural area not subject to the training review or state management review process, you'll say, how does this relate to me? Most state dots, I think, I know most of the state dots in Region 3 will conduct oversight of their subrecipients. So we've got New York State DOT is here. Can you tell me a little bit about the efforts that New York State DOT does in the area of compliance oversight to ensure that your 5311 subrecipients comply with applicable rules and regulations?
Briefly, we have a full comprehensive.
Can people hear Tim? I mean, sorry, can people hear Bill well enough?
It's a big room with tall ceilings. So don't be afraid to speak up. Shout if you need be. Thanks, Liz.
Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you.
So we have a comprehensive review of our 311. So I'll take further to ground. Do those reviews. So in addition to that, what we know with the 53, our competence and advice is check in with us every time we're about to change some sort of this is a checklist that you use. Certainly.
We're good. And I thought I heard a couple of other state DOT representatives here. Can you speak to any type of oversight process that?
Yeah,
sure. And thanks, Bill, for being the Phil Donahue of the procurement session here at the Transit Knowledge Sharing.
Okay, so I'll start off by saying that I'm not directly involved in our oversight efforts for our 5311 subrecipients, but I think I have a general idea of how it works. Although some agencies might be able to correct some things I get wrong. But at any rate, so we do an annual review process. Historically, it was an on-site review, but I think since COVID, we've been doing it remotely. And I know at least in the past, the idea was there's the different focus areas of the review process. And I think we try to hit like half of those the first year, and we go out the next year, we hit the second half. So each year we just be going out and doing those on-site reviews or remote reviews and work with the agencies to walk through the areas we have responsibility for overseeing as a state DOT. So I don't think I have more detail that I can provide than that. That's the gist of it for us.
Okay. Do we have any other state DOT people here who comment? We'll pass the mic just right now. Yeah, please.
So for our program, we come up with a different system. So we have a compliance review, and if we determine that individual transit is high risk, we go out like yearly, and then if they're not high risk, then they go, then we'll go out every 3 years. So it actually has helped the transit a little better, so they can have a little more in their guidance, and if they have more questions, that's basically.
Very good.
In Virginia, we actually go out about every 2 to 3 years. We have, about 25.
Thank you. And although those state level efforts are outside this data and the pie charts that we've shown so far, most of the hired guns, the state docs will use to conduct the review will keep tabulation of the types of findings that arise. And I can tell you from working in Oregon for more than a decade, North Carolina for 2 decades, Illinois for 2 decades, the findings that arise in 5311 systems are almost identical. Procurement is always a high profile target area. It generates the most findings in usually these state level oversight reviews. So even if you're a 5311 funded recipient, what we're talking about today is relevant to you. So I've got a little interactive slide here, testing your visual recall of those pie charts, looking at this individual procurement findings. What do you think is the #1 finding, no matter what region you're in, whether you're urban or rural? What do you think is the #1 procurement finding in the oversight process? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Bid process errors. Good answer. That's not #1. Oh, we've got 2 winners there. That's absolutely right. Missing clauses. And we're going to go ahead and dive into each of the top 11 findings here in the TR and state management review process. And we're going to talk a little bit, put Liz on the spot to talk a little bit about this software application called Procurement Pro, which is designed to tackle this very problem. I'll go ahead and give you #2, lack of a cost and price analysis. How many of you have ever heard of a document called FTA Circular 4220.1F? Yeah, that's kind of the Bible. If you read that document, it says you've got to do a cost and price analysis for every procurement. It's actually no longer true. The circular's out of date. We'll talk about that as a problem and what FTA says you need to do to remedy that problem. Lacking an independent cost estimate. Basically, the cost and price analysis goes hand in hand with the development of an independent cost estimate. We'll talk about what the deficiencies are in that area. So now that we've got 3 of the top deficiencies up there, what are some other deficiencies that you guys can think of that might be a potential problem? Areas where you've been called out in the past, or areas that have proven problematic for you in the past?
Very precise Title VI.
All right, Title VI, imposition of Title VI requirements. That's one of the so-called flow down requirements, and it will apply to your contracting activities. Disadvantaged business enterprise requirements. You'll see that it will appear on our list. But the next one is pre-award post-delivery. Relatively new to the transit landscape over the last several years. And we have some requirements associated with the pre-award before we order rolling stock and post-delivery requirements. And sometimes, particularly those of us who tend to rely on state purchasing contracts, sometimes get tripped up on these requirements. Incomplete procurement policies. If you've ever read 4220, it by itself is about, what, 150 pages? It's a long circular, covers a lot of topics. If I look at the procurement policies of some of your organizations, I just did a triennial review a few weeks ago. Their procurement policy was 4 pages. Needless to say, we had 7 procurement findings associated with that recipient. They just simply didn't include it in their policy, and sure enough, because it wasn't in their policy, they were making mistakes in their procurement activity. So having a complete procurement policy is critical to your success in avoiding compliance findings. There's that little requirement that says you must maintain documentation sufficient to provide a history of the procurement activity. What in the world does that mean? Anybody have any ideas? What is a written history of a procurement? Do we have to write a book? Retention policy. Yeah. I got somebody in the back. Documenting the solicitation, absolutely. Anything else that you might think should be included in a written history of your procurement activity? Pre-bid, pre-qualifications, procurement milestones. We'll talk specifically. There are some I'm going to refer to it, I might refer to it as the super circular. Have any of you heard that term? 2 CFR Part 200, Uniform Guidance, short title, but it addresses grant administrative requirements, audit requirements, and cost allowability principles of federal awards. FTA follows that guidance religiously. Looking at some of the lesser but common procurement findings. Responsibility determinations. What do we mean by responsibility determinations? Anybody want to venture a guess? Sam. Who's Sam? I tried to memorize all your names, but I don't recall anyone being named Sam here today. Well, who is Sam? Sam.gov. It is a website. And essentially what's happened is the federal government is trying to consolidate several of its procurement-related web databases, including something known as the excluded parties listing system. There are people who, surprise, surprise, have defrauded the federal government in contracting activities in the past. And as a result of those misdeeds, they have been debarred or prohibited from participating in federally assisted contracts. You as an FTA grant recipient, whether you're a direct recipient from the region or whether you're a subrecipient from the state DOT, are not allowed to do business with bad guys. And that is your responsibility to root that out. And one of the things you have to do is verify that the vendor is not on the barred list or the excluded parties listing system. And you would do that by looking in sam.gov. Now, FTA, because they can be a little bit ornery, really doesn't believe you if I'm doing your triennial review and you tell me, oh yeah, we checked sam.gov. I'm not going to believe you. Prove it. And so one of the bits of advice that we'll give you in this session is when you check sam.gov, you have to get an account, you'll log in. It's helpful to know the precise corporate name of the entity you're searching. You'll go to sam.gov, you'll plug in that name, and it will likely print out or display, there are no results for this entity. Print that out and put it in your written history file. So that way, when a triennial reviewer comes in to look at your procurement files, and your state oversight reviewers look at your procurement files, you can say, yeah, when we went out to purchase 1,000 widgets back in 2021, we checked our low responsive responsible bidder, the ABC widget company, and here's our sam.printout verifying that they were not disbarred or excluded from participating in this federally assisted contract. All right, the question is, does that apply to any procurement regardless of size? FTA's general rule of thumb is that it's above the micro purchase threshold, you should be doing this. There are other branches of the federal government, Medicaid, for example. I promised myself I wouldn't say anything bad about Medicaid. they'll actually make you, in some states, check every vendor you're doing business with every 30 days, just to make sure there's no change in their debarred status. But generally, FTA will apply procurement requirements, with the exception of Davis-Bacon in construction, small construction contracts, which has a $2,000 threshold. It will make you apply these standards for everything over the micro purchase threshold. And we'll talk about purchasing thresholds a little later in today's session.
What you're trying to review right now, person doing the review, gave the sand in their file. They're asking for more. Like, the only thing that we do, that we provided additionally to that, was checking references from the companies. And we've added that, and that seemed to.
Yeah, when we do our deeper dive on responsibility errors, you're going to see that there are things in addition to just checking sam.gov that you have to do to determine vendor responsibility. And part of it, we can blame Congress, because we have in transit authorizing legislation, Chapter 53 of the United States Code, we have specific responsibility requirements that go above and beyond 2 CFR 200. They're pretty close, but we have a few other options that you'll see there's more detail in 4220 than there is in 2 CFR 200. Sole source procurements. We just decide that because we like the Acme brand of copiers, that when it's time to replace the copier, we'll get another Acme brand. That's a sole source procurement. Federal procurement regulations limit your ability to do business with your preferred vendors, because the overarching principle in federal procurement activity is maximum open competition for every procurement. And so there are a lot of hurdles to jump in order to justify a sole source procurement. So there are some very, very legitimate opportunities, procurement opportunities, where it makes sense to conduct a sole source procurement. But when that happens, the burden is on your shoulders to justify that the conditions associated with your election of the sole source or non-competitive method meets federal requirements. We'll talk about what those conditions are in our dive into that topic. And then finally, pre-award and post-delivery certifications are but half of the story associated with those requirements. We also have some audit responsibility, particularly as it relates to Buy America. And this can be rather complex, and it's relatively new, and it's difficult. I've done some on behalf of clients, and they're not easy to do. They're very, very time consuming. Oversight of subrecipients. This is primarily one for state DOTs who, because of the 5311 program, it's a state administered program, they have subrecipients. It is also possible for you as an urban recipient to have a subrecipient. And so this will apply to a lesser extent to 5307s as well. And when you have a recipient-subrecipient relationship, the uniform guidance is very clear. You have oversight responsibility for ensuring that your subrecipients are in compliance with federal regulations. Sure, the state DOT may come in and do some oversight reviews. Sure, FTA may come in and do some reviews. And you can kind of piggyback off of those levels of effort. But you cannot excuse yourself from the basic obligation that you are ultimately responsible for the compliance activities of your subrecipients, period. So those are our top procurement findings. We're going to focus on each one of these topics in a few minutes. Any questions so far this morning? Let's go ahead and move into some, I think, let's just call these prerequisites. Some institutional things you should have in place in order to minimize or mitigate potential procurement findings. First of all, there are several key resource documents. If you are involved in purchasing at your organization, quite frankly, if you want to stay out of the doghouse, these are documents that should be readily available at your workstation, on your computer, because they are essential. The first is 2 CFR Part 200, the uniform guidance. And you will say, well, geez, I know my finance officer really is on top of that topic. And I thought this had to do with audits and allowable costs. And you would be absolutely right. But the middle part of that document deals with overarching grant administrative requirements that apply to all 37,000 recipients of federal financial assistance. They apply to FTA grants, they apply to HUD grants, they apply to Department of Labor grants. OMB sets the standard, the minimum requirements, and then each branch of the federal government, each executive branch, is then obligated to build upon that base set of rules and structure a program of grant administrative requirements that fits their legislatively approved grant programs. So prior to the super circular, we basically had this overarching documents issued in the form of OMB circulars. So OMB circular A102 years ago, prior to 2014, used to be the governing document for public entities. Then USDOT took that overarching guidance and said, we're going to build upon this to make it fit USDOT programs or FTA programs, FHWA programs, etc. And you will hear and read to this day, you'll see this frequently, something known as the common rule. Well, the common rule was 49 CFR Part 18 if you were a public agency, 49 CFR Part 19 applied to nonprofits, 5310 recipients. And basically that was USDOT's implementation of the Uniform Grant Administration requirements. Now that I've given that history lesson, forget everything I just said. Because all of those documents, A102, 49 CFR Part 18, Part 19, none of them, they were trashed December 26, 2014, the effective date of implementation of 2 CFR 200 for the so-called super circular. So there are elements of procurement instruction in this guidance that will apply to FTA grants. So it is very useful to understand the requirements of the third-party contracting guidelines circular 4220, but you really have to know 2 CFR 200 as well. And you'll see most of the procurement, the nomenclature of the super circular is a little bit unusual. It's 2 CFR 200, then there's a period, and then a 3-digit code. Most of the procurement stuff is around 200.316, I think, to about 327. Those are the elements related to procurement in the uniform guidance. Then there's the FTA circular. If you're involved in purchasing and you're not familiar with this document, I know as a reviewer, I'm in for a long day. I'm going to find a lot of problems. And this sometimes occurs for those of you who are not freestanding transit authorities, but might be units of local government. You're part of the municipal government. You're part of the county government. Because when that happens, typically there's a central service department, a purchasing office, who has all responsibility for purchasing of all the operating departments of that city or county government. And those folks are usually pretty good at state and local procurement requirements, not so good on FTA procurement requirements. And so one of the systemic lessons that we need to have is when we're in that situation where we rely on procurement advice and actions of a centralized department, we need to step in and make sure that that purchasing officer is not only following the requisite local and state rules, they got to be following the federal rules as well if you're using FTA to fund that procurement. 49 CFR Part 1200, and I think that really should be 2 CFR Part 1200. When the super circular was issued, it actually came out December 26, 2013. And executive branch agencies of the federal government were given 12 months, actually 6 months, to communicate back to OMB any issues that they may have in their authorizing legislation that was counter to 2 CFR 200. And then OMB and the executive branch department, in this case it would be US DOT, would negotiate some of the changes. And then those exceptions to the regulations would be published in the Federal Register. And that came out in December of 2014. And so the US DOT exceptions to the uniform guidance are in 2 CFR Part 1200. Fortunately for us, this isn't a whole nother document we need to be aware of. The US DOT exceptions to the uniform guides are relatively small. Perhaps one of the most notable items is there is a requirement when a federal awarding agency is making a grant, they must take into account the risk associated with awarding that grant to your agency. And FTA said, well, wait a minute. With respect to the 5307 program, what's the point of assessing risk? Because we don't really have a choice in awarding urban formula funds to urban areas. Congress dictates that when the Census Bureau and the Department of Commerce says you're an urbanized area, you are entitled to that 5307 money. FTA doesn't have a veto vote on that. You're entitled to that money. And so FTA argued, we really shouldn't be bothered with this risk assessment process because we have no control over who gets the money. Congress has dictated that. That is one of the exceptions to that you'll find in Part 1200. BPPM, Best Practices Procurement Manual. Has anyone ever seen that document? Bill, anybody else? You're smiling back there. Have you seen it? It's riveting. Kind of reads like Grisham, doesn't it? Who can tell me what BPPM is? Go ahead, Bill. Who's got the mic?
It is a wonderful guide. It's a riveting guide. They use some consultant expertise, guidance, considerations on it. But certainly, it's a hands-on kind of practical.
It's a pretty good explanation. I like to think of it as it's a how-to guide, an implementation guide, if you will, of FTA Circular 4220. It will get into the weeds about how transit agencies have tackled this problem in their own procurement activity. It came out as a manual in its earliest edition, and it was, don't click print if you download it. It was hundreds of pages. It was updated in 2016, and it's a little bit shorter, but it's still pretty useful. Don't click print though. It's still pretty lengthy, but it is a good resource document. So once again, if you've got your own procurement officer in your transit agency, or you rely on the services of a centralized procurement officer, this is a document they ought to have, because it covers procurement methods, some of the problems that you might encounter in procurement activity. And the one thing that it has always done that most of us have always relied on is in an appendix, there is the actual, remember our #1 finding, missing clauses? it provides some suggestive language for you to use in your solicitation and contract documents, the language that your transit agency should use in signing agreements with vendors and contractors and the like. And a lot of people rely on the BPPM for that very purpose. But don't just look at the appendix. It is an excellent resource document. Yeah, I think most people would probably concur it should be on the New York Times bestseller list if you're a transit agency. Then finally, yes.
Is it a compilation of best practices, but it's not?
It's my interpretation. Someone disagree with me, please, if you have a different view. In the earlier version, it had a lot of specific examples drawn from actual transit agency practice. And the intimidating part about the initial draft was it was clearly written for the MTAs, the SEPTAs, the port authorities of the world, not necessarily a small 5311 agency in Southwest Virginia. And as a consequence, when you started looking at examples and best practices, you go, holy mackerel, what does the MTA in New York has to do with my 11 vehicle rural transit agency? And you said, this can't be of any use to me, and you put it down. I think the 2016 amendments is far more generic with less big city examples. And to a certain extent, it made it more useful to more people in the smaller urban category, small UZA category. And in particular, it's more readable and digestible by rural transit agencies. And so a highly recommended document, it's a good resource.
The key thing is to understand that it says over and over again. We're going to suggest rules, guidelines.
You peeked at one of my slides. There's a catch-22 in procurement. And one of the things is FTA will state, even though we've given you all this guidance, we are not going to assure that that represents all the compliance responsibilities. That's ultimately on your shoulder. And if we have failed to tell you something and you don't do it, we're still going to hold you accountable, even though we never told you you had to do it. That particular with clause analysis, for example. Another resource that I want to highlight, I don't think a lot of people use this, and it is a little bit, it can be dated in certain circumstances. I wish FTA would keep up with this better. But on the FTA website, if you go to just the FTA homepage, just go up in the search bar and type in procurement FAQ. And there you will see a soup to nuts alphabetical listing from A to Z of probably 150 different procurement topic issues where people have written at FTA asking for guidance, and then FTA in 95% of the cases will give you an answer and provide guidance to a specific procurement question. And the questions that are posted on that FAQ website are the same questions that you'll present to me during this workshop. They're common questions, and they're relatable to whether you're the MTA in New York City or whether you're a small 3-vehicle system in North Carolina. Very useful resource and relatively easy to find the answer to your question because of that alphabetical table of contents that is right on the home page of the procurement FAQs. The only disconcerting thing about that is periodically they kick the can down the road. You'll ask a lengthy, involved question, and rather than give you the answer, they'll just say, you better call your region on this one. And that's all they say. And I don't find that very helpful because the questioner probably has already asked the region that question already.
We did have a comment in the chat to refer to the annual FTA certifications and assurances, which are updated for you.
Right. And I'll refer to it a little bit later. when I talk about specific reference documents that you can use to develop which clauses are applicable to this procurement contract. And there's something known as the FTA Master Agreement. So if you're a 5307 recipient, this is usually a big, thick package attached to your contract. If you are a 5311 recipient, typically the contract of financial assistance you get from the state DOT typically will have the master agreement provisions packaged in some other form or fashion as an attachment or an appendix to the state DOT contract. But generally, most state DOTs in their contracting activity will cut and paste key provisions of the master agreement and put it in your subrecipient agreement. So that is a key document that we will cite in a very specific section coming up. The other thing I want to point out, I talked about FTA Circular 4220.1F is FTA's third-party contracting guidelines. It's kind of the Bible. However, it was first produced in 2008 is when 1F was produced. And it's been updated. So if several years ago you printed out a copy and that's the copy you used, one of the cautionary notes I would exercise is you might want to just go to the website to make sure that the document you're referring to is the most recent update. And quite frankly, that most recent update is now a little bit long in the tooth. And FTA acknowledges we're behind the 8 ball on this. But one of the things anecdotally I'm told is that FTA knows that circular's out of date, but in order to issue a new rule, there was administrative guidance that they had to rescind 2 rules. And FTA said, I don't have 2 rules to rescind. And as a consequence, their hands were tied in issuing an update to 4220. I've heard headquarters personnel say that a new version of 4220 is coming in FY22. I haven't seen it yet. Still a couple months to go in this fiscal year. It's coming. I'm told it's been in final draft stages forever, and they're just trying to get it through the legal processes now. COVID has slowed a lot of things down, as well as congressional financial relief and all the extra COVID money that we've received. FTA is really busy these days, to say the least, and the issuance of circulars has probably taken a back burner to trying to get the money out under the pandemic relief funding. So we've got this situation where most of this, our go-to document is 4220.1F. But then we also have this overarching document at 2 CFR 200. And there are going to be things that are different. So for example, I've cited the example of a cost and price analysis is required for every procurement. That is language that you will see in 4220. In 2 CFR 200, they changed that rule, now saying that a cost and price analysis is required in every procurement over the simplified acquisition threshold, which was uniformly set at 150 with the issuance of the super circular, and then it was raised to 250. So technically speaking, we have a conflicting guidance. Do I believe 2 CFR 200 or do I believe FTA 4220? FTA's own advice is that when you see a difference, conflicting information between the 2 documents, it's probably always a good practice to pick up the phone and ask for clarification. But the general rule of thumb is 2 CFR 200 supersedes FTA 4220. And that actually makes sense because when you look at the hierarchy of applicability, we have legislation at the highest rung, we have rules in the form of Code of Federal Regulations, and then we have guidance. in the form of program circulars. And so 2 CFR is a rule. It's embedded in the Code of Federal Regulations. That's what CFR stands for. And so FTA just is merely saying this takes precedence. So the good news is, particularly if you're a procurement officer, cost and price analysis is a pain in the butt. They're hard to do. Now we don't have to do them for anything over the $250,000 threshold. Unless, of course, we have our own internal municipal local policy where we're going to do them at a lower procurement threshold. That's your choice. You can go below that. Some other key changes where you will see conflict between 2 CFR 200 and FTA 4220 is in purchasing thresholds. Because I think in the circular, you'll see the small acquisition threshold being cited at $100,000. That's no longer the case. It's been raised twice since that was the threshold. It is now at the federal level, $250K. You'll see in the circular, the micro purchase threshold is $3,500. That's no longer the case. It's $10,000. And those thresholds trigger various requirements in your procurement methods, so they are important. And that's just really a high-level overview of some of the key changes that the uniform guidance has. And you will see, referring to both, and we still have a lot of transit officials who will say, no, I've got to follow 4220. This has been my Bible for years and years and years. I don't want to deviate from that. That's not the case. If they were to reach out to FTA and ask the question, is the small acquisition or micro purchase threshold 3,500 or 10K, FTA will say 10K. Now, if you're a state DOT, the uniform guidance gives states far more latitude in its purchasing activities than it does for other types of what the uniform guidance refers to as non-federal entities, NFEs. States are allowed, basically, if they adhere to certain federal requirements, can follow their own state legislative purchasing policies. Everybody else, you follow your state and local rules as appropriate, but you also must meet federal requirements. And in some respects, it's always been my opinion that the purchasing rules are actually the most strict for what represents probably the least sophisticated subrecipient in the FTA universe are nonprofit agencies who get 5310 financial assistance. They got to adhere to everything. They get no hall pass in any area. They've got to follow all the rules, which is one reason why many states adopt a traditional type 5310 program. They keep it strictly on vehicles so that you don't have to get into the weeds on procurement of office supplies and the like with your 5310 agencies, because you have hundreds, potentially hundreds of subrecipients, and the oversight activities would be overwhelming to most state DOTs. But some of the, getting back to the state requirements, state can follow their own procedures, provided that they meet certain FTA requirements. So even though there is no specific period of performance limitation in procurement contracts in 2 CFR 200, we do have a period of performance limitation on rolling stock procurement, and you have to adhere to that. You have to adhere to the competition requirements. You cannot impose any Buy Pennsylvania or what's known as geographic prohibitions in your, or geographic preference in your procurement activities. You must follow Brooks Act procedures. Architects and engineers are special people. And when we buy their service, it's very different than buying other professional services. And one of the key things is we don't use price in making our contractor vendor selection. price comes in the contract negotiation phase, it does not get engaged in the procurement phase. And this award to responsible contractors. It's not only checking sam.gov, but it's assuring ourselves that that vendor has certain capability or technical capacity to perform the project. States, they can't avoid those circumstances. Again, I think I've made note that nonprofits, quite frankly, from a regulatory imposition, they get dumped on the most. They've got to follow everything. They've got to know everything if they're using federal money in their purchasing activity. The other thing that is of note is oftentimes at the local level, we use a combination of funding to support a procurement activity. And we may go out and buy a $600,000 clean diesel bus. And we may get $599,000 in state assistance, and we might use $1,000 in FTA assistance to fund that $600K purchase. As soon as $1 of federal assistance is involved in that procurement, all federal requirements apply. Anytime we have these joint funded projects, we need to be aware of what the mix of funding is. Purchasing officer should always be aware of this fact because it's going to trigger whether or not these other requirements will apply or will not apply to this particular purchase, and it will trigger a bunch of additional vendor requirements. So $1 taints the pool is the leverage or the coverage on that one. And again, when we talk about procurement, we're not only talking about the purchase of equipment, goods, services, and the like. We're also talking about leasing of those same things, the acquisition of property, acquisition of supplies and equipment, or the acquisition of professional services. All of that falls under the umbrella of procurement activities. So some organizational things that I think should be in place at the local level to dampen down the potential for procurement compliance deficiencies. I've talked about this issue with municipalities and counties where there's often a central service agency, a purchasing officer at the local government who handles purchasing on behalf of all the operating departments, including the transit agency. And that individual may be very skilled at what Pennsylvania procurement law is, but may not have the wherewithal to know the ins and outs of Pennsylvania or FTA transit activity. When we have these situations, it's incumbent upon that purchasing officer to understand the federal requirements associated with that purchase. It will involve a establishment of a partnership between the key purchasing officer or chief executive officer of that transit agency and that local procurement officer, because you are going to create a systems of checks and balances so that that local procurement officer doesn't overlook or miss federal requirements in your purchasing. Some omission of federal requirements have consequences that are far worse than a deficiency in a triennial review. You make a Buy America mistake, what happens? Anybody know? Anybody from Houston? Yeah, it'd be a failed procurement. FTA cannot participate. If you've awarded a contract to a vendor who fails to meet Buy America requirements, and you approve that contract, and FTA will come back and say, we cannot participate in that procurement. You made the mistake, and it's going to be costly. I just a couple of weeks ago, again, was doing a procurement review, and they needed mobile radios. And they're a small UZA. Mobile radios, the brand that they're used to using was on a state purchasing contract. and they go, hey, this is a no-brainer. Rather than conduct our own procurement, we'll buy off the state contract. And they issued that purchase order. Guess what? Final assembly of those mobile radios isn't done in the United States. It's done in China. The local procurement officer never looked that up. Just assumed because it was on state contract, it must be good for them to buy. They issued the purchase order. We discovered it with training and review. Thank God for the shipping crisis, supply chain issues, because the radios hadn't been delivered yet. They were a year overdue because of supply chain issues. And that entity was able to cancel the procurement based on what they learned during the triennial review. Otherwise, they would have spent $153,000 on mobile radios that they were counting on 80% federal participation. And they would have had, the city government would have had to shell out for that federal share. So consequences can be significant and not very pretty. And sure enough, you're in a small town, the local newspapers love to publish front page stories. ABC Transit screws up, cost city council $100,000. They love those headlines. You had a question back here.
How did they discover, not the state contract, how did they discover that it wasn't, the final part of that process was?
How was the state?
That's a good question. The state doesn't have to comply with Buy America. The transit agency did. The state contract was primarily developed to support the state highway patrol agency, not transit. Transit just basically saw their brand of radios on the contract and figured that that would be a lower level of effort for them to acquire rather than develop their own RFP or IFB. And the only way it was discovered, because they didn't check it, is some eagle-eyed triennial reviewer happened to know that Motorola radios are assembled in China. They used to be assembled in Illinois, not anymore. Because that reviewer did a lot of work in Illinois, he knew about that migration of production from Illinois to China. And so when I saw when we do triennial reviews, we select 5 procurements for detailed review. And then we look at your procurement records, or we ask you to upload them if the review is done remotely. And something in my head told me I needed to look at the radio purchase, because I saw that they listed the vendor in their listing of procurement activities. I knew they were in trouble. So we selected that procurement for detailed review and then did our due diligence as FTA contractors and discovered that this was a problem.
So how is how do you check something like that?
Well,
Can we repeat the questions? I know it's kind of annoying, but
sure, I will. The question is, if you're the transit agency purchasing officer, what do I do to figure this out? Because I'm normally assuming, these people at the state centralized procurement office, this is usually a gold standard for purchasing. I'm going to get my lowest price off that state contract. I'm going to save myself a lot of time and effort. So what do I need to do? Well, as soon as that transit agency purchasing officer, before they issued the purchase order, should have known that Buy America would apply, because this was a manufactured good, a mobile radio, and Buy America applies to manufactured goods. He should have said, okay, Motorola is a preferred vendor under the state cooperative purchasing contract, and we want to get the Motorola 1000 mobile radio. I need to look up, and it's readily available from just looking up on Motorola's website where they're manufactured. It should have been caught before the purchase order was ever issued. But again, because this particular purchasing officer just assumed that the state knew what they were doing, should have realized that this contract was driven by the Highway Patrol, a state-funded organization, not a federally funded organization, and probably should have looked. Again, Buy America is going to, if we're over the Buy America threshold, $150,000, it's incumbent on us to understand where that manufactured good is being, where final assembly occurs.
So when you purchase a state contract, like you said, when you purchase a state contract, other than having that expertise, or like you said, it's any item, the other way you look at this, any item like that.
Yeah, thanks. So the question is what other types of situations and might arise that I can offer some advice? Generally speaking, on state purchase contracts, usually the state DOTs work hand in hand with the state centralized procurement agency for vehicles. And so generally, if it's vehicles, the Buy America requirements, all the pre-award, post-delivery requirements, the state DOT's going to be on top of that, and that's going to be embedded in the centralized state procurement office solicitation, contractor certifications, and the like. So generally, vehicles are pretty good. You're on safe ground as a buyer buying off of a vehicle state contract if the state DOT was involved, because they're going to cover your backside. If it's other goods and services where the public transit unit of the state DOT hasn't actively been at the table in the development of the specifications and in the solicitation, then it's likely that the state purchasing agency is going to be unaware that Buy America under US DOT regulations will apply to manufactured goods, and they'll just award a slot, an IDIQ, to whatever vendor was low responsible bidder. And it's in those other non-vehicle procurements, in my mind, that pose the most risk for you as the transit agency in buying off of that state contract. Now, the good news is that FTA has recognized that scenario. And in the case of the mobile radio scenario that I built here in our session, had the city, before they issued the purchase order, said, we know you're the state vendor under contract 1012. And we know it was not done with FTA recipients buying off that contract. If you will agree as a vendor to FTA terms and conditions before you issue the purchase order, when the first transit agency comes to the table to buy that item off the state contract, and Motorola would agree and presumably say that, yeah, we can comply with Buy America, then you can buy off that state contract. FTA will permit that. So even though the vendor's already under contract with the state, it wasn't done with FTA anticipation. If the vendor will agree to adhere to FTA standards, FTA will let you basically execute a supplemental agreement with that vendor, put it in the procurement file, and you're golden.
Okay, so that answers my question, because that's what we, that's on subsidies, we should purchase it.
Yeah, and the general rule of thumb the FTA will advise you is we want the first FTA recipient buying from that vendor off of the state contract. They need to be aware that that vendor has to agree in writing to FTA terms and conditions. And did I see another question here?
Just to share best practice in New York, better than I. We're subject to a New York State procurement checklist. Whether we're buying goods, services, rolling stock, whatever, there are different thresholds for different. And you say yes or no, you have the clause, you have independent conflict. Checklist, if you get the checklist imposed into your procedures, or procurement procedures for some organization, it might be helpful, because that might be an issue that happened in China.
You will hear in several subsequent slides, I'm a big fan of checklists. And this is one area where this can keep you out of the FTA doghouse. You had a question.
So, clarification. The FTA, everything has to be by America.
If it is iron, steel, or a manufactured good or rolling stock, has to meet Buy America. Buy America doesn't cover office supplies, paper, and it's got to be a manufactured good.
From the FTA.
Yeah.
Is there a dollar amount?
Then your Motorola example. If Motorola would have agreed with the state to assemble that in Illinois, get the parts from China to assemble in the US, would that have met approval?
I can't say because there's something known as a Buy America audit, where in the conduct of that audit, basically we evaluate on the basis of components and subcomponents. And component systems have to be produced in the United States. Subcomponent systems can come from foreign sources. And in the case of, say, rolling stock, you have to basically do the total of all the components and subcomponents, and we need to make sure that we achieve 70% domestic content. And the only way you can do that typically is by getting a manufacturer's list of all the systems in that manufactured good, looking at the dollar value, and then looking at the country of origin. And there is a workbook that FTA has produced that has some Excel template tables that I highly recommend for use, that enables you to do these types of calculations. And when in doubt, this is such a specialized area. This is really an area where the use of third-party consultants, I'm a third-party consultant. I'm not very good at patting myself on the back or promoting our industry. So forgive me for stepping outside my comfort zone, but this is an area where third-party contract assistance is highly valuable to you. Undertaking a Buy America audit can really be complex. Opportunities for errors exist. It's better to hire someone trained to do that type of work, who has that in their corporate specialty, somebody like AECOM, for example, to do that type of work. Robin, you had your hand up next.
Oh, right. So when I'm listening to you, you're talking about the percentage of manufactured content within certain, like your
Yeah,
vehicle.
well, I took vehicles, there's a
Right.
dedicated percentage.
The people get OEM enhanced things into that vehicle. So part of the vehicle contract is not just, it's not just the shell, the chassis, the transmission, it's the electronics that are in it. I mean, buses, like vehicles, are full of it. So is there a dollar amount? So say if they hadn't bought those radios separately, but they had been part of the overall bus, with the manufactured content of the radios have gone into the overall content of that vehicle?
Then it's likely that in the Buy America audit, they would have dealt with communication as a component system, and it would include the radio, it would include all the radio mounting hardware, it would include the cabling, and that would be identified as a component system, with chassis being a component system in most rolling stock, the body shell being a component system, and it goes on and on. A typical rail car might have 25, 26 different component subsystems or component systems, each of which may have 4 to 5 subsystems. And you've got to look at country of origin and dollar value of every one of those to ensure. And curiously enough, rail cars, Federal Railroad Administration and FTA, their Buy America rules are slightly different. It gets incredibly confusing, and that is why I think my recommendation to, follow the advice of Kenny Rogers, know when to hold them, know when to fold them. You just can't assign Curtis at South Carolina DOT, just can't assign the new kid on the block, go do this Buy America audit. They'll get lost. This is an area where outside expertise is really a benefit to the transit
So is
agency.
there a dollar value on that?
Well, the Buy America threshold, and this is another little critical thing that happened with the issuance of 2 CFR 200. The Buy America threshold initially was $100,000, but it was tied to the simplified acquisition threshold. And when 2 CFR 200 went into effect December 26, 2014, the simplified acquisition threshold went from 100K to 150K. As a consequence, the Buy America threshold went to 150K. FTA kind of got caught by surprise on that. They didn't like that and realized that it's likely the simplified acquisition threshold would change again in the future beyond their control. And Congress stepped in and then fixed the Buy America threshold at $150,000. So this is an area of some confusion because some of us, old school, yeah, Buy America is set to the simplified acquisition threshold. No, it's not anymore. Buy America is 150, simplified acquisition threshold is 250. So that's something we need to be aware of, and we've seen transit agencies make that mistake. Their procurement policies tie Buy America to the simplified acquisition threshold, and so the purchasing officer says, okay, 250. But in fact, Buy America is triggered at 150, and this could produce a compliance deficiency we want you to avoid. First.
So Rich, if it had been $100,000 contract, not there, wouldn't it?
That's right. Buy America does not apply to anything less than the Buy America threshold. Hang on, I'll get you. Go back to first transit.
The fact that it wasn't vetted by GS contract. State transport. If a subrecipient is purchasing an item requesting funding for that item, no matter how big or small, but it's being placed on something that was umbrella under Buy America. Is that in the conversation right there? Because there's no funding required for the purchase of that unit.
Generally speaking, if there are no FTA dollars proposed for use in that contract, none of the FTA requirements will apply. So had this municipality opted to purchase the radios totally with local funds, that would have been the end of it. But
So as a subrecipient, once we receive the vehicles that we're leasing them for grantee, we take it over from there. We take over the financial responsibility of that item going forward under the TAM plan, of course. We do it and we spend the money on everything going forward. It comes out of our bank account. That is that situation.
yeah, and the only reason I pause for just a brief second is there are some regulations that apply regardless of whether federal expenditures are there or not. The ADA is one of those areas where the receipt of FTA funding is irrelevant to the applicability of the requirement. It's whether you're a public agency or whether you're a private entity primarily engaged or a private entity not primarily engaged. Yeah. Right.
Some of the usual radios as an example.
But in terms of Buy America, if you use local funds to buy the vehicle, then it can be made in Canada, no big deal.
But it can be placed on the item that was on the vehicle specified.
Yeah, now, there's one other caveat to this, just so that we can't make anything simple when it comes to purchasing. There have been some disputes between our government's administration or executive branch and certain other nations that shall go nameless. So there are specific legislative that has been passed by Congress that says we cannot buy certain types of audiovisual equipment from certain nations, i.e. China. Congress went after surveillance equipment. So if you're putting cameras on board your buses and you're buying that camera surveillance equipment now, be very aware of the manufacturer and the vendor that you're buying the equipment from, because some of it is now prohibited. Congress has passed a law that you cannot use federal money to buy equipment manufactured by these Chinese companies.
Who is part of the procurement? Buy that Chinese.
Correct. Yeah, correct.
Right. Oh, okay, all right, so once what you're wanting, you know, the basic end to this conversation is if you're working yourself.
You're generally pretty, you're free from federal oversight.
Your case with. Wasn't there a contract?
Yes, they actually got multiple compliance deficiencies. And curiously, the assistant GM had something in the file that said, here are the applicable conditions. Buy America was checked, but they never, for some reason, the purchasing department overlooked that check and never thought about it and issued the purchase order. Go figure. So again, part of this is systemic institutional parameters that you need to engage. There is a relationship. We just don't say, call the procurement officer and we need a dozen widgets. There needs to be a deeper conversation than that. We are proposing to use grant funds from VA.2021.019, and it will be used to supply 80% of the $157,000 threshold. And here are the list of requirements we need to make sure are included in our solicitation documents. That is a conversation that needs to take place between the transit agency personnel who would be familiar with the FTA requirements and the city purchasing officer who may not be familiar. Now, another thing I'm going to recommend is let's train our central procurement officers in our requirements. Let's send them the NTI training class so that they are aware of it. So in the event we as transit officials, because we wear a lot of hats and we're moving at 100 miles an hour, we forget to tell them Buy America is going to apply to this procurement. They'll pick that up and say, hey, Curtis, are you using federal monies on this? Because I'm going to have to add your Buy America provisions to this solicitation. That's what needs to happen. Great discussion. I hope it's been helpful to you because this is one of the endemic problems that we find, because we as transit professionals, you know, we got to put rubber on the road every single day. We got to deal with COVID. We got to deal with operator shortages. You know, we've got other personnel dealing with procurement, and we may know what needs to happen, but is it actually happening? It can slip through the cracks, and this is what happens. So again, this partnership, in particular, we've got a lot of things in transit that are unique to transit that no other branch of city or county government has to deal with. There, to my knowledge, there's no such thing as pre-award and post-delivery requirements for other federal agencies. Buy America does occur in other branches of the government, but our requirements are somewhat unique. ADA issues and the like. There's a lot of things that are on the table here. So I mentioned that we've got uniform thresholds, and these are at the federal level, and these should be cross-cutting across all federal grants. The micro purchase threshold currently is $10,000. The small acquisition threshold is $250,000. It's always been my rule of thumb, the compliance at the local level is enhanced if you're in step or in sync with federal procurement requirements. So if you have the opportunity, because many of you might have lower thresholds, that is perfectly okay. But be aware that if you have a local policy that says our micro purchase threshold is 5,000 and our simplified acquisition threshold is 100,000, that's the standard by which FTA will hold you accountable. So you could not use micro purchase methods on a purchase of $6,500 if your threshold was $5,000. Even though the feds would permit it, your policy does not. We ask you to follow your policy. So that's the thing to be aware of there. And in order to avoid confusion, when local policies in sync with federal policies, the better off everyone is. The chances for compliance deficiencies is lessened. And we are seeing a lot of legislation, particularly by freestanding transit authorities who kind of control their own destiny. They get to make their own procurement thresholds. If it's permissible under state law, they're adjusting to the 10K to 50K levels. So we're seeing recent policy procurement changes and updates reflecting the federal permission, because they too are recognizing when they're in sync with the federal level, it's less likely there could be an anomaly that results in a compliance deficiency.
Biggest thing that we found too lately, there's a lot of huge things changing in the industry. We find that there's vendors that we've used for 10, 15 years, and they rebid, they win the contract, so forth. But we've actually had a bunch of them not or step up and say, well, we're not going to do the Buy America, we don't qualify. So be careful that vendors actually change it. Don't get comfortable with choosing a specific vendor and go, they've worked for the years past, because we have had lately a couple of them that changed it, and we literally had to rebid it or go back.
And I know we've talked a lot so far this morning about Buy America, somewhat in a negative context, like it's a real impediment to our ability to do our jobs. And I would just maybe bring in the political side of this discussion. I mean, the reason there is a Buy America is because regardless of which side of the aisle you are on, it is a pro-US jobs type bill. And it has the support of both blue states and red states. So, and there are exceptions. There is an opportunity for what's known as a Buy America waiver. And so there are certain conditions, depending on which branch of the government you're dealing with, where waivers can be granted. Generally speaking, if the product good is not available from a domestic supplier, no one in America produces a number 14 widget, and they're only produced in France, we can write to the administrator of FTA, spell out our case, and ask for a Buy America waiver. Now, I've done some tracking of waiver requests, and they're a tough row to hoe. It's got usually notice of the waiver request has to be published in the Federal Register. There's an opportunity for other people to object to the granting of a waiver. There's a waiver request period. No federal program administrator likes to grant waivers because it makes it look like they're anti-USA. It's a tough row to hoe, but if you can prove your case, waivers will be granted. I think it's getting a little tougher. There's going to be a whole new process, a government-wide process for evaluating Buy America waivers under the current administration, and that may make it even tougher still. That's yet to be seen because this is relatively new. But there are opportunities to use foreign goods in your procurements and do it legally with FTA assistance. If you can't meet the component requirements, you can request a waiver, and we have seen such waivers, and it's generally the waivers that typically get granted is there is no domestic source, and after publication in the Federal Register, no domestic source has stepped forward and said, yeah, we can ramp up production and have a number of 14 widget available within 9 months. When that is lacking, you will generally see a favorable outcome to the waiver request. But it may be a year, and you're in the midst of a procurement, it's going to slow your procurement schedule up by 12 months, maybe longer. So just be aware of that fact if you think waivers are an opportunity. Generally, I don't recommend that you pursue that unless it's really something that your agency requires and needs. So any questions on this need to forge partnerships and be aware of some limitations that we have in what is otherwise an excellent procurement strategy, i.e. buying off of state contract? Any other questions, comments?
Because 4220, one enters on the date.
Yes.
CFR 200 existing.
And that's
we're always 4220.
And that is why Liz thought this session would be noteworthy.
Liz in a circle.
Like I said, I've heard very knowledgeable people whose opinion I respect at headquarters at FTA tell me it was going to be out in 2021. And here we are, almost at the end of FY, federal fiscal year 22, and still not out. And just behind my breath, I'm off the record, turn that off. Blame the lawyers.
Those are-
Robin's a lawyer, I can do that. A recovering attorney, yes.
Sorry.
All right. So my next module is, how do we avoid, we saw the top 10 list of typical procurement violations. Let's take a deeper dive on some of these things. Missing FTA clauses was number one, whether you were in the state management review process or the training or review process. And I dare say if any of our state representatives here had their list, their database handy, they would probably say FTA missing clauses is probably something that they see at the subrecipient level as well. And some of the issues that we have here are you're using federal money to buy stuff and you just simply issue a PO and there's no Title VI requirements. There's no ADA requirement. Any of the requirements are not there. Or you've got some FTA requirements, but not all, because your list is out of date. You developed that list in 2016, and there have been like 4 or 5 updates to the master agreement with new clauses and requirements that should be in third-party contracts that flow down to vendors and subcontractors that your legal team was unaware of. So you're missing specific clauses. Reviewers, generally, whether you're conducting a state review of a 5311 subrecipient, or whether you're doing a state management review or a TR, triennial review, the reviewer has a checklist. And when they're looking at spot checking specific procurement files, we're going through the solicitation and we're looking at those clauses. We have a checklist. Bam, 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 bam. And if we can't check a box off, it may, at the discretion of the FTA region, result in deficiency. Reviewers don't render deficiencies. Only FTA renders deficiencies. The reviewer gives advice to FTA and FTA makes the final determination. Or there are certain things that will apply or will not apply. Davis-Bacon, for example, applies to any construction-related contract over $2,000. But if you're buying audit services, you don't need to include Davis-Bacon in your solicitation documents for CPA services. So it gets complex. And there's a list of about 30 or more topics that may apply to any of your third-party contracting activity. In addition to this construction versus professional services, individual items that may apply may have a dollar threshold. So there are things like Buy America that will not trigger until you get over the 150K level. And so this creates this matrix of requirements. What am I procuring? What category of procurement is it? What method of procurement am I using? Am I using FTA dollars? And how many FTA dollars will I be using in the procurement? This gets to be very complex. And that is why this particular area generates the most findings. So as someone pointed out earlier, some of the references you need to be aware of here that you should be aware of. The FTA master agreement or your agreement, the contract of financial assistance with your state DOT, all the things that you are required to impose on your vendors and your subcontractors should be listed in that contract. And it's either embedded in the body of the contract or usually bundled as an appendix or an attachment to the contract. I would also call your attention to the best practices procurement manual, because it has suggestive language for the actual clause itself. And the BPPM also has a little heading, says on the applicability, the dollar threshold. There is a matrix in the back of 4220, and why the dollar values might need some updating. That matrix is appropriate because it will outline the specific types of procurement categories that FTA references, such as professional services and A&E, construction, rolling stock, materials and supplies. And I'm missing one, but forgive me. Also, 2 CFR 200.234 has very specific, these clauses must be in your lower tier agreements. Make sure that you cross-reference your master list to 200.324. I'd also refer you for specific requirements and language to Appendix 2 of 2 CFR 200, the super circular. And then finally, because this is so complex, because it's always been the #1 issue, FTA has recognized this and reached out to the National RTAP program to try to create some help for you folks to sort through that maze. And the end result was the initial version of something known as Procurement Pro. And it is designed as a web-based software application. When you sign up for an account, you then enter information about your procurement, and it'll ask you lots of questions. And then it would spit out all the required clauses that are uniquely tailored to that procurement. Now, Procurement Pro has undergone revision since its initial release. It does more than just generate clauses now. And it can be an extremely powerful tool. More importantly, some of you who are 5311 recipients and working as subrecipients to your state DOT, there might be state requirements that apply to your procurement. National RTAP has reached out and is working cooperatively with the states to develop those conditions as well. So not only has the product improved since it initially just gave you federal requirements, it now gives you federal and state requirements.
Well, if the state participates and does the work to get their thresholds and documents into the system.
And for those of you who are unfamiliar with RTAP, RTAP stands for Rural Technical Assistance Program. And you may say, well, this is a product that's only available for then 5311. I'm a small UZA, I'm an urban recipient. I'm not a rural agency. This software sounds great, but gosh, it's not going to be of any use to me. That's absolutely 180 degrees wrong, because in point of fact, there's no distinction, none whatsoever, between the procurement requirements applicable to 5311 as applied to 5307 recipients. There's no difference. So even though this was done primarily as a tool to assist rural entities, you will see in the FTA contractor's manual, the guide that I use in conducting triennial reviews, right there in black and white in the urbanized recipient guide, Procurement Pro, as a resource to get all the required clauses in your procurement solicitation documents. And I promised I would put Liz on the spot. Robin's here as well. I know this isn't Liz's product. She didn't oversee that particular product, so I'm putting her on the spot. But Liz, anything else you want to do?
Sure.
This is the unabashed advertisement section of our workshop. And I promised Liz to put in a plug for Procurement Pro.
Yes, well, actually, my colleague Nancy does oversee our technology tools, including procurement is here. So she's saying, I mean, I could say it, but they could say it better. And I'm just awkwardly plugging my computer in here because I don't have a power cord. So it provides the appropriate clauses and certifications, and it also has different templates and checklists. Can you guys hear me okay? It provides documents and checklists. So the Quick Pro just gives you the clauses and certifications, and it is going to give you anything that might pertain to the project information you put in. You know, you put in the cost, the type of procurement, things like that. And it'll give you that information. And then it'll also, if you want to use the full system, it'll give you some checklists and things. We talked about checklists. We also have like an independent cost estimate template and things like that. So you can use that to make sure you have all you're going through all the requirements. But most people, I would say, do use it for just getting the federal clauses and certifications, and that is updated regularly.
And it's free, is it not?
Yeah, it's free. It's free. You just sign in because it is a web-based product. So you sign in, but anyone can use it. And we do frequently get questions from like Metro North Railroad outside of New York City, questions about procurement and using that. So that's not our main audience, but it's no extra cost to us, and it's a great resource.
Is that a question?
Some recipients require recipients certification assurances. Is there a relationship of those certification assurances that the recipient is signing that he's adhering to, and how does that relate to the contractors? Should the contractors be signing on to those certifications and assurances? If so, should that be a clause? Or can you comment on it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and one where I might be at odds with other procurement specialists. The FTA master agreement is built upon the contract instrument between FTA and a designated recipient. And the applicability in the language of the clause itself applies to recipients. It may or may not flow down to a subrecipient or a contractor, which is why we sometimes see in procurement solicitations, we're the ABC Transit Agency and we need to purchase 1,000 widgets, see section 2 for technical specs. All vendors must agree to comply with the terms and conditions of attachment A, because FTA funding is involved in this. And what attachment A is a cut and paste of master agreement clauses. It is my belief as a procurement professional that that actually introduces a lot of uncertainty to vendors, because they're going to read it and say, this clause doesn't apply to me because it refers to the recipient, and we're a contractor. So this clause doesn't apply. And they don't understand the flow down relationship of the clause, or don't get that far down that, down at the bottom of the page, 7 paragraphs later, there's a brief statement. This clause must flow down to every lower tier agreement subcontract. And the vendor doesn't read that. They only read the first paragraph where it addresses recipient compliance and then draws the conclusion, this doesn't apply to me, next page, next requirement. And so I do not advocate either incorporating by reference or just cutting and pasting the master agreement in there. I think Procurement Pro, or the best practices procurement language, is infinitely better because the language is tailored to applicability of contractors, not recipients or subrecipients. That's just my 2 cents, and I'm on my soapbox on that category. It's not illegal, but I believe that a stronger, more viable contract instrument arises when you address language specific to the vendor and what the vendor must do to satisfy the terms and conditions of that contract.
So how does Quick Pro address certification and assurance requirements?
Yeah, generally, and what's being referred to here is that the whole procurement area, you've got to certify that you've got the technical capacity to manage your purchasing activity in accordance with FTA requirements. That's part of the certs and assurances. And the master agreement, you're basically agreeing to comply with the whole litany of federal requirements that apply to the use of FTA funds. Again, not all of them flow down to the contractor level. And so just picking up the master agreement clauses, in my mind, adds confusion to the solicitation document, that we now leave it to the vendor to sort out, does this apply to me or not? How does this impact my pricing, my ability to compete for this bid? It adds confusion and perhaps dampens competition, which is the last thing we ever want in a federally financed procurement. So the master agreement provisions are for recipients, not contractors, is what I'll say here. And if FTA wants to shoot me for that, I'll go quietly. But that's my personal opinion.
Rich, we have a question from the chat. Can you explain the difference between a certification and insurance, or are they saying the same thing?
Generally, in common parlance, it's the same thing. The certification typically relates to a specific topic and requires a written signature at the bottom, whereas an assurance tends to be a collection of requirements and it requires a signature to the group of compliance requirements.
Thank you.
Generally speaking, the requirement to add applicable clauses applies to purchases over the micro purchase level. And in most instances, since most of our procurement activity is in this micro purchase or small purchase threshold, particularly those of us in the 5311 community, our purchases are between 10K and 250K overwhelmingly. All we have to do is have competitive quotes. And that generally then leads not to a contract, but to the issuance of a purchase order based on those quotes. So how do we convey these required clauses in that type of typical procurement arrangement? And my advice has always been, when you issue a purchase order, there's usually some standard terms and conditions that your city, your county has added, i.e. The city of Smithville is a unit of local government and does not pay state sales tax in North Carolina. All items must be delivered FOB to 1112 Main Street, City Hall, lower level. You will have a series of conditions that apply to that purchase order. Add the federal requirements. If I use 8-point font, I can generally get the add-on to my standard purchase order down to about 2 pages. And if I got to go to 7-point to squeeze it on 2 pages, I will. But that way, when you issue the purchase order, I'll have one language on page 1. By signing this purchase order, you agree to supply the good or service in the time frame and for the price specified in your quotation, and you agree to comply with all the conditions in part 3 of our purchase order. And that's the way I like to see all the applicable terms and conditions being conveyed to the vendor. That really covers my bases. And it doesn't make municipal purchasing procedures that much more complex. Now, your city purchasing officer may disagree with that assessment because now he has 2 different purchase orders, one when municipal funds are used and one when FTA funds are used. But that's the price of doing business with the federal government. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out, we've got that Davis-Bacon thing that has a very, very low procurement threshold that has not changed in 100 years. If it's a construction contract over $2,000, Davis-Bacon must be in there. Even if it's an $8,000 micro purchase construction, Davis-Bacon needs to be communicated to that vendor. All right, I promised, we've been at it for 2 hours now, that we would take a break. So let us refill our coffees and catch up on phone messages and the like. Let's reconvene at 10:25.
This is so good. I just appreciate you dragging yourself over here.
I did have a question. I think you guys can hear me. Okay. Another question. Can you, is Davis Bacon required in a procurement document for something like repainting a room with an estimate of $1,500? Or is it just for actual construction?
Yeah, there's very specific language, and I might have this embedded in the PowerPoint in my notes as to the type of activities. It's generally construction. If it's the repainting at $1,500, it's going to fall below the $2,000 threshold, so Davis-Bacon wouldn't apply. But generally, renovation, rehab type things would trigger Davis-Bacon if they were using federal money to finance the construction activity. And again, if you're lucky enough to have other financial resources outside federal financial assistance, an awful lot of the procurement process sometimes is driven by what's the level of complexity of my procurement? Can I fund it with local funds or state funds and leave federal out because it'll make my life that much easier? If it's a smaller procurement, that may represent a legitimate option. And you're not violating any rule by avoiding federal compliance issues if you're using state and local money. And so that's a decision that managers have to make in programming and executing tasks, purchasing tasks, and the like. And there's no foul in using state or local money with the specific objective to avoid federal complexities. That's okay. And you're not going to get dinged on that. So just part of the decision-making process, part of the procurement planning process.
So to dovetail the construction question, would something as simple as landscaping at the facility be considered construction?
Generally not. Now, if that landscape contractor has to erect a fence, that may cross over. But if it's just mowing, snowplow type activity, that will not trigger Davis-Bacon. All right, so some of the best practices in terms of federal clauses. And again, this first one is there to just make sure that we don't set ourselves up for subsequent failure in cost and price analysis, is we should always have an estimate. Usually in a purchase order system, and most local governments, transit agencies use purchase orders, it does require some level of approval. And generally, in order for a supervisor to approve it, they want to know how much you're proposing to spend under that purchase order. So the purchase order estimate constitutes your independent cost estimate. And so long as you're doing your due diligence so that the number you put on that PO request is reasonable, and that's the operative word, then that will satisfy the independent cost estimate for small purchases. You don't have to go out and hire an engineering firm to spend 40 hours to develop a cost estimate for a dozen widgets. That's a level of effort disproportionate to the benefits gained. The other thing that I suggest, in addition to making sure you always have an independent cost estimate, is classify the procurement. And FTA looks at procurement, and this is one of the things that Procurement Pro will do for you, is that FTA aligns its requirements by procurement class. And the procurement classes are professional services and A&E. So what do we mean by professional services? Typically for transit agencies, this is audit service, professional planning services, such as you might hire RLS and Associates to do a TDP. That would be a professional services contract. It's legal services. If you don't have your own in-house counsel and you have to hire legal services, that would be professional services. Drug and alcohol, third-party administration of your DNA testing program, that would be a professional services contract. Architectural and engineering services would be professional service contracts. Your city government says, we don't want to hire 100 people. Let's hire a management company. Since First Transit's in the back row, you want to hire First Transit, that's in its own category of operations and management type contracts. The third category is rolling stock. The fourth category is construction. and the fifth category is materials and supplies. And by fitting all of your procurement activities into one of those 4 or 5 buckets, it will enhance compliance, because if you're using things like Procurement Pro, it's going to channel everything you need based on the bucket that you've selected or it has selected for you.
Just going back to the categories.
And you will see, just by the way, these are the column headings in that matrix in Appendix D4 of FTA Circular 4220.1F. So this isn't the gospel according to Rich. This is FTA materials.
Okay. So taking your brain for some wisdom and advice. This happens to be last week. I had a technology procurement. Where does it really fall? Recommendation. I think I have something that said materials and supplies.
Yeah, my recommendation is that FTA needs to put another column in the table and have ITS projects as its own category. But yeah, your decision to drop it in the materials and supplies bucket. It could also be professional services, because you're in many instances buying intellectual property. So it's a gray area for me. I believe it belongs in its own category, but that's a decision way above my pay grade. And no one has listened to my idea so far.
Isn't there a difference in the clauses for capital versus professional services, non-capital goods?
Not necessarily. The applicability of a clause isn't really driven by the funding ratio category. If there's FTA involvement, it typically is the triggering factor, not whether FTA has classified it as an 80% reimbursable capital object or non-operating object if it's 5311, or whether it's a 50% capital. Construction is construction is construction, rolling stock is rolling stock, rolling stock.
Right. It just seems like that when you're employing someone, that you have different clause by server.
True. But again, that would be materials and supplies versus professional services. And so hopefully Procurement Pro keeps you on the straight and narrow.
Well,
Thanks, Rich.
it doesn't automatically do it, but it does provide kind of what you said, like it's going to fall under this. This is what is professional services. And then you do have to select it yourself, and then the clauses and certifications will be tailored to that.
But it gives you advice. It doesn't
Right.
just say, pick one and you pick one checkbox. It's gonna ask you for information that will help you make us, or will give you guidance as to what should be in a professional services contract or what should be in a material supply. It'll provide some definitional assistance, as I recall.
Yeah, it gives examples of what falls into what.
And again, if you're in doubt, the matrix in Appendix D4 is where those 5 categories come from. And again, a good independent cost estimate needs to be in hand before you drop it into one of those 5 buckets, because once it's in that bucket, you'll see the list of applicable clauses, and about half of them will have a dollar threshold. And if you read that appendix, it will either say all or it will list a dollar amount. And so you've got to have that ice in hand ahead of time. Failure to have the ice, I've seen people develop their ice after they've issued the solicitation. And that is just a no-no. And it creates all kinds of problems later on, because you're going to overlook key compliance responsibility. And again, the matrix requires a lot of self-help. Procurement Pro can solve some of those problems. And again, I've touched on this once before. A lot of times people before Procurement Pro would rely and fall back on the best practices procurement manual. And it has like a to Z, it's a numbered listing. here are the applicable federal clauses you need to have in your third-party contracts. And it will have, this clause will apply to contracts of this type over this threshold. And quite frankly, people get lazy and they'll pick up that whole document, they'll include all 30 clauses and attach it to a procurement solicitation for widgets. And 5 of those requirements do not apply. And so why are you putting it in the solicitation document? Because if I'm a vendor making a good faith effort to supply a competitive quote or bid to your solicitation, this is only going to confuse me. And so rather than take the lazy approach of just slapping this together, all 30 clauses, and put it in attachment A to my RFP, you really need to sort through which applies to this procurement and only give them what the vendor needs to comply with. And that, I think, is the major benefit of using Procurement Pro. The software will make that decision for you. And this isn't just National RTAP telling you what they think applies. They worked hand in hand, correct me if I'm wrong, with FTA headquarters, and they were getting opinions and expressions of where things should be classified throughout the entire development process. So again, FTA won't warrant if you use Procurement Pro, you won't have a deficiency. They will not say that. But they were actively involved in the preparation of that work product. And again, that catch-22 that I mentioned previously, even if you're using specific FTA documents, FTA doesn't give you a hall pass and say you must be compliant because you used our tool, because FTA will always say, ultimately, you're responsible for compliance. And if you get in a TR, a triennial review, and the reviewer finds something, even if you follow our guides, and they're right, then we're still going to ding you for it. So FTA doesn't warrant any of their documents and does not assure absolute compliance. So the other thing that I want to call out here, again, this is laziness on the part of purchasing officers. A lot of times you'll see a clause in a solicitation document. ABC Transit is using FTA financial assistance to support this procurement. Therefore, all FTA requirements apply. And that's all they say. The requirements themselves are never listed in the solicitation document. And essentially what that does is it leaves to the vendor's initiative to go track down what on earth might apply to this contract. That is a very risky proposition. You never want to be in that position. Do not do that. And because you ultimately have the responsibility for defining for that vendor what they must comply with to successfully complete the terms of the contract. And you're in the driver's seat. It's your job to tell the vendor, not the vendor's decision, oh, this clause applies to me and this clause does not. That's going to end up, because ultimately you're the one who's going to be under the FTA microscope, not the vendor. FTA doesn't deal with vendors. FTA deals with recipients. And so you're the guys that are going to have your reputations on the hook for this. And again, so these incorporation by reference are very bad procurement ideas. Use Procurement Pro, get the exact clauses that will be applicable to this contract, and then have the vendor do his due diligence in responding to the solicitation. All right, lacking required cost and price analysis. Kind of good news, bad news here. In the majority of most of the procurements we do, if there's adequate competition, price analysis alone is satisfactory. And competition, normally, if it's a competitive procurement, the underlying rationale behind federal procurement is the marketplace drives the price. And if you had an open procurement where there was maximum competition, then that is a reasonable price for the good or service. That's the whole purpose of having a procurement system. And therefore, price analysis, which is a process that is designed to assure you, the buyer, that the price you're paying for the good or service or equipment is reasonable. That's the conclusion we want to reach. And if we have adequate competition, we can use the competitive process to make that assurance. Now, if it is a professional services procurement where we want to know how many hours of Liz's time, how many hours of Robin's time are going to be involved in the performance of this service. And we may want to then have to research is, you know, since National RTAP pays Robin $600,000 a year, is that a reasonable payment that we're going to take on buying their services? Or is our opinion of a National Association ED $200,000 a year? Those are the kinds of decision points you make in a cost analysis. And admittedly, a cost analysis is infinitely more complex than a price analysis, because you're looking now essentially at a price analysis at every category of expenditure. Is their salary rate acceptable for the job classifications proposed? Is there fringe benefit rates within range of typical A&E firms? Is there travel reimbursement policy consistent with GSA guidelines or policies of our organization? Are there direct costs? Are they charging us $10 a page per copy or 10 cents per page per copy? Those are decisions that you have to evaluate on a line item by line item basis in conducting a cost analysis. And it can get very complex. But the good news is, in the majority of our procurements, price analysis is what we have to do. And the only thing that we need to be aware of is there are certain triggering circumstances where FTA says we must do a cost analysis. And those are situations where we're making a cardinal change or contract modification, where competition was not adequate. And this would be both sole source and single bid situations. A cost analysis is required generally. Sole source procurements, unless reasonableness can be established, and change orders. These are typically circumstances that may trigger the need for a cost analysis rather than a price analysis. And generally, because it's simpler, if you're tasked with the assignment 7 ways to Sunday, I'd rather do a price analysis than a full-blown cost analysis. So I might do a price analysis where a cost analysis is required. This will get caught in a triennial review or a state management review. So it requires that somebody in the purchasing department understand the difference between the two methodologies and the conditions that trigger the absolute use of a cost analysis. And I think that's the key message we want to convey today. And again, price analysis has several different methods, all of which are real easy. Obviously, if we got our RFP for audit services, if we got 10 RFP responses, we can obviously document adequate price competition in that solicitation. Generally, federal government's kind of weak in this area. Adequate competition typically exists when 2 or more responsive proposals or bids are received. You may have higher thresholds. Some states require 3 bids, for example, or 3 quotes. But generally, from a federal perspective, competition is achieved if 2 or more entities submit a proposal or bid. You can conduct a price analysis based on catalog or market prices, comparisons to previous purchases. If we've purchased copy machine paper before from Office Depot and we've done it 10 times in the recent past, we can use those cost or purchase orders as the basis for a cost analysis for our most recent solicitation of quotes. Comparison to our independent cost estimate. When catalog pricing does not exist, our ICE may form the basis. And typically, I know when I worked for North Carolina DOT, if the price bid or quoted was within plus or minus 10% of our independent cost estimate, we deem that to be a reasonable price, and we could move forward with the next stage of contract award. And you may have your own policies in that area. But any one of those types of methods, evaluating price competition, establishing catalog or market prices, comparisons to previous purchases, are all acceptable methods of price analysis. And the key that oftentimes we see is you do these things, but it's not documented in the written history file. And the reviewer can't make a determination that the price analysis actually occurred. And so not only do these relatively simple tasks, but document the file. And you can use checklists and other types of handy tools to facilitate completion of these steps. And so I've got in the PowerPoint, and I'm going to stop here. Liz, can you talk about if any of our audience members want a copy of the PowerPoint? Would this be available to them, and how can they go about doing that?
Yes, definitely. Gotten a couple of requests already. We can either put it in the conference retreat app or on our Zoom events page. So we will make sure that all attendees at the conference, since I don't know exactly who is here, will find out where to find it. And we'll also have the recording. So you can relive the 4 hours of this wonderful session, or get to the point you want clarification on and share with colleagues. So we'll make sure that all attendees find out where to get those.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yes.
Just a couple other caveats we need to be aware of in a price analysis. And here's a repeat: 2 or more, this is the federal guidance, 2 or more offers that meet the requirements of the solicitation. So if I got 3 bids or quotes, but I found out one of them doesn't meet Buy America or some other condition where I have to deem them non-responsive, then that doesn't get, you don't get to count that in this competition requirement. So if I had 3 proposals, one was deemed non-responsive, then I actually only got 2 responsible proposals, but that still meets the requirement. But if 2 of the proposals were deemed non-responsive and I only had 1 responsive proposal, then I don't have adequate competition. I no longer am eligible to do a price analysis. I've got to do a cost analysis. In terms of establishing catalog pricing, I don't think I need to go into a lot of detail on this one. With the internet, we don't need to have a stack of catalogs on the purchase officer's desk anymore. We can go and quote current pricing for most of the goods and services that we acquire. Market pricing is the same as catalog pricing, but instead of looking it up in a book, we use other methods such as reaching out to peer transit systems. What did they pay for the same good or service in the most recent 12-month period, etc. A comparison to previous purchases and comparison to ICE are somewhat self-explanatory. And again, generally, if a price analysis cannot lead your purchasing officer to a conclusion that the price the transit system is being asked to pay for this good or service is reasonable, if we can't make that determination, even if all the other factors for a price analysis exist, we then have to fall over and do the more complex cost analysis. And again, what we want to see in terms of a train or review or compliance oversight process, we want to see some evaluation of the individual components that make up the cost proposal. So for example, let's say, I'm going to pick on First Transit a little bit here. Oftentimes when we're out seeking management and operational services, you know, there's probably 100 objects of expenditure in their cost proposal. But rather than go through all that, we may in our price proposal form, please quote us on a cost per revenue hour of operation. And we leave it to the bean counters at First Transit to come up with a figure of price per hour that includes fuel, management, regional officers, corporate support, etc. Now, if we didn't have adequate competition, we had to do a cost analysis. I'd have to go in and get from First Transit their detailed breakdown. So a lot of times what I do is I evaluate bids on the basis of that unit sum, price per revenue, hour of operation. But I ask them to supply the supporting documentation that led and arrives at their $68.75 per hour, and ask them to submit that as documentation with their bid. I don't look at that unless I need to trigger a cost analysis, because if competition is adequate and I've got bids from TransDev and First Transit and the local cab company and whomever, and I've got adequate competition, maybe price analysis is adequate.
So you're saying there's enough people and the prices are not overly fair. Stop there.
If I can make a determination, let's say if First Transit was the low responsive bidder, if I can make a determination that that appears to be reasonable based on market conditions, because I've checked.
Other vendors.
Yep. Then I can get by with a cost analysis, and that would not trigger a deficiency that ABC Transit failed to do a cost analysis when they hired First Transit.
Right, but say the other three vendors are like $90, $92, $94, and we're in at 68.
Yeah, in that case, then we have to go back to responsibility, because oftentimes when that wide variation against our ICE occurs, my initial thought is First Transit didn't include something in their bid that we expected. Maybe they didn't realize that they had to bid on both the ADA and the fixed route service. And why are they so different than everyone else? It would trigger a cost analysis in my mind, because I would be unable to conclude with professional certainty that your bid was reasonable.
And it would be responsible on your part just to take the lowest bidder comes.
Right. And that's why we often, on these types of contracts, do not use a formal bid process. We use a proposal process. Yeah.
Rich, I had a question. Mark, you talked about the market. What if you use in your previous performance and to develop your ICE, and due to something, for instance, like COVID, ADA vehicles prices in some instances go. This week, but the contract out. It started before, and now it's after, and all the other things that's coming in place. So, what do you recommend as a reviewer that we need to have around documentation? Because there's nothing there we can go to say we knew this is going to go triple.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Obviously, supply chain issues, chip shortages, and the like. Anybody who's been out to bid on a vehicle lately that relies on chip technology, that's double whammy. Shortage of chips and supply chain issues. Price of vehicles, particularly paratransit vehicles, has escalated remarkably over the last 12 months. So using past purchasing experience no longer is providing a reasonable basis that the price that we got in June of 2022 is reasonable in comparison to what we got in May of 19. That no longer can be made. Yet doing a cost analysis on a vehicle is a tough nut to crack. So far, I'm unaware of any guidance that FTA has provided to the network of contractors who do triennial reviews. And we have monthly phone calls where we talk about issues and problems. And we talk about the great escalation in vehicle pricing and delivery schedules, but we haven't, to my knowledge, FTA has not weighed in on the impact that these events have had on your conduct of cost analysis. So I'm interpreting this is my personal opinion, does not represent the view of FTA. I want to be clear on that point. It's my personal opinion, you're getting somewhat of a pass due to unique market situations that you deemed it reasonable given current circumstances, chip supply chain issues, and that you've accepted the bid at June 22, even though it seems inconsistent with our prior purchasing experience. I'm unaware that anyone has been dinged for making that conclusion so far. So, but don't quote me on that. But that's, I know personally, that's what I'm doing as a reviewer.
But I just wanted to bring up, I know that there's been some state associations that have gone head to head and have gotten, using the cost analysis, have basically made them bring it down much. I mean, they really have had costs go up, but their escalation and their costs have not been to. And so that by using cost analysis, you can basically put some pressure on them if they want to keep doing business with you as a state to bring their price more in line for costs. And if you want more information on that, I think Lisa Baycott and Jackie Montgomery and Deborah Bach really, really concerned about this, but I am just emphasizing that this cost analysis is a way for you to basically not default. That hurts. That just hurts because you don't have enough money. Your grant doesn't get bigger. Just chunk that's taken out of it. And rolling just encourages bad behaviors. So, not, you know. So I'm not giving any answers and I'm not disparaging anyone. People are doing what they do. And I think that we have tools that we can use that help us come through it, not feeling like we're done.
Yeah. So a couple best practices, tips to leave you with. Again, because of this infinite advantage in terms of your workload that a price analysis has over a cost analysis, this really translates into a critical mantra that your purchasing office should have. Adopt policies and practices that foster competition. So your procurement officer may be prone to putting a notice in the local newspaper. ABC Transit needs to buy 12 widgets and we'll soliciting bids until June 13th. But if all the widget suppliers are in another state, you know, how are we promoting competition with that type of advertisement? Adopt practices where you identify vendors in the marketplace, and whether they're in Maine, whether they're in California, whether they're in Alaska, that will fall out in the shipping and delivery schedules. You'll still get a viable product at a good price when you get competition. Adopt measures that will foster competition. And I know in the Pacific Islands, you guys have, you dealt with supply chain issues before there was a COVID, because getting materials and supplies to Samoa or to Guam or to Northern Mariana, any of those agencies had extra hurdles to follow. So some of this, you're in your own unique universe as an island there. But adopt practices where you communicate to vendors and create maximum competition and participation in your procurements. And if need be, use RTAP money, use your FTA grant money, send your municipal or county purchasing agent to NTI type training or other FTA sponsored State Transit Association meetings so that they get to hear from state procurement officials and state public transit office officials as to what the latest and greatest changes to the procurement landscape are. Robin and I were talking over the break. It's an ever-changing landscape. So staying in tune with your state transit association, signing up for FTA Dear Colleague letters. If you go to the FTA website, they regularly communicate on certain topics, and there's a whole list that you can receive email correspondence from FTA, and you can check the box for procurement activities. And so if there's a change in Buy America in the next 6 months, you'll get a Dear Colleague letter explaining that change that you can forward to your procurement officer. And so there are some best practices to help you overcome procurement issue number 2. Procurement issue number 3, lacking independent cost estimate. What we see is there is no independent cost estimate. You just simply failed to prepare it for whatever reason. You prepared the ICE after you issued the RFP or IFP. That's no good. Or the ICE lacks independence. Too often, I see a transit manager wants to buy a vehicle and they go to a specific supplier and say, hey, I need a 24-passenger body on chassis vehicle with a wheelchair lift, brawn lift, and 2 forward-facing positions. What would you sell me a vehicle for? $90,000. Guess what? I see that email in the procurement file, and guess what the ICE is? $90,000. The I stands for independent. Guess what? That is not an independent cost estimate. That's a dealer quote. That lacks independence. Don't do that. Yeah.
Most of us, when we go buy a bus.
Can
If
you
you've
repeat
done,
that question?
yes, the question is, most of us fund our vehicle purchases through grant funds because this is a pretty deep dive to use local funds for. So we rely on that federal financial assistance. And in order to get the financial assistance, we got to apply in trams, or we got to apply to our state DOT in an annual grant cycle. And in order to put the budget amount in there, we've got to do our homework to figure out what the bus costs so that we've got enough money in grant funds to pay for the bus. Most states might create categories and say that if you want a 16-passenger BOC vehicle, light duty, we're going to fund you at $75K, period. The state will tell you what they will give you for a certain piece of equipment. But if you are in a state that lets you ad lib those things based on your needs and requirements, then yes, it's possible that the grant application homework will suffice as the independent cost estimate. And the only thing you need to be aware of is sometimes states don't have a reputation for moving grants forward quickly enough. And so you apply in April of 2020 and it's June of 2021 before you're actually got the money in hand and you're out the bid. Then the burden is on you to revisit that ICE to see if market conditions have changed and requires an update.
I guess if the state is telling you how much the bus costs.
Most states won't give you the option. Like in North Carolina DOT, where I used to work, yeah, we said, this is what you're going to get. Like it or lump it. And if the bid prices are over, you know, eventually we came up with extra money, but we basically said, this is the set amount. I got New York.
New York DOT. Certainly to Vito's question and point, when we roll out our applications, we put in what the current adult bus contract is for lots. So that's how the price is determined. Also, very good points about delays in the rates.
Yeah.
Initially, yes.
Right, so basically, people have to go against. That's not a step that we're responsible for.
Yeah, I may not have enough time to get to it in this presentation, but I've got another slide in the PowerPoint that one of the things you have to be careful of when you're buying off the state contract, and even if it's an item that has the state DOT has been hand in hand working with the state procurement officer, so you know all the FTA requirements are there. In theory, the obligation for compliance still rests on your shoulders. So even though they say, yeah, we're good on all the FTA compliance items, you'll still need to get a copy of their independent cost estimate. You'll need to get a copy of their bid determination and their reasons for selection and that sort of thing, the FMVSS certification, those obligations will remain with the recipient. They should have that information in their file, even if it's a redundant step that the state has already taken. They would have looked to make sure that that vendor complies with federal motor vehicle safety standards at the time of award, but you need to make sure as the buyer, you're getting a copy of that verification. Yeah, what most states are doing now, rather than getting hit with 50 requests for a copy of the VMSS certification from ABC Bus Dealer, they just make copies available on your website. You download it, put it in your own written history file. Make sure the ICE is documented. Sometimes you do the due diligence and you have a great ICE, you never wrote it down. Somebody knew it in the top of their head, but they didn't put it on paper. Don't make that mistake. Pre-award, post-delivery certifications. Again, sometimes what we see is people buying vehicles off a state contract. They figure the state's taking care of everything, but then we come into your organization and we're asking for these various certifications or copy, because we're not evaluating the state unless we're doing an SMR. We're evaluating your procurement. And if they've permitted you to buy off that contract, ultimately you're responsible for making sure that they complied. And so we're going to look for that Buy America certification. We're looking for that purchasers' specifications were met by that manufacturer in their bid proposal. Even though they evaluated that before making an award, we want to make sure that that certification is in your procurement file. The other thing is we seem to have confusion with the Buy America threshold. And so some people are not having that in their file because they still think the Buy America threshold is 100,000. They bought a vehicle for 125,000. They're unaware that Buy America is at 150 now, and that type of thing. So we need to make sure that you're on top of current thresholds. Piggybacking and joint procurements. Procurement is expensive. The tasks of writing a specification is extremely time consuming if you have to do it from scratch. And I've always said that there's no RFP that's been written from scratch. You know a good idea when you steal one. You borrow somebody else's specification, you build upon it to build your own set of needs. And in particular, when you buy off a state contract, you need to make sure that even though the state probably handled all the I dotting and T crossing when they made the award and put that vendor under the contract, you've got to have verification of those facts in your procurement file. And so some of the things that we're seeing is that the Buy America certifications aren't there, or they're blank. Sometimes we see a Buy America certification in file, but the vendor never signed it. I don't know how that happens, but and the verification that the certification made at the pre-award stage actually came to fruition in the post-award stage, where all the component costs are analyzed so that the domestic content goal is achieved, which is now 70%. We're seeing, and I just caught one of these in the FY22 review cycle, their policy was still stuck on the old 60% threshold. Congress has raised that in a series of stepwise progressions. It went from 60 to 65, and now it's currently set at 70. And their procurement policy didn't keep pace with that increasing standard. And so they were evaluating Buy America compliance based on 60% domestic content, not 70%. So you don't want to be caught behind the 8 ball in that area. So again, we've heard a couple individuals now, National RTAP, New York State DOT, this notion of using checklists have been embraced by a lot of folks, and I highly recommend that you do that. In terms of looking at evaluation of compliance with your specifications, what are known as compliance with the purchaser requirements. There has to be, that's part of the pre-award and post-delivery requirements. Typical specification is narrative. We want a Thermo King 1000 air conditioner, and you'll describe the salient performance characteristics of that typically in writing. And you'll have tens, if not hundreds, of technical elements of your specification, battery capacity and the like, ceiling heights. You'll have all kinds of technical specifications. Compliance with those specifications often is facilitated if you develop a spec checklist where you've reduced that narrative into a cell and a table, and then you have the vendor, I've complied with this specification, or no, you specified a 78.5-inch ceiling height in the interior of the vehicle. Our ceiling height is 78 inches. And then that is submitted with the bid so that you can evaluate, will I approve the 78-inch ceiling height? And it's easier if that's done in tabular form. And that is the quickest, best way I know to go through the purchaser requirements compliance element, is with these specification checklists. And you'll frequently see these in a lot of IFBs and RFPs these days. The other thing to be aware of if you use a piggybacking process or you're buying on an option from someone else's procurement, FTA publicly will say we encourage this type of procurement activity, and then they throw up 10 things you must meet in order to buy off a piggyback contract. So they tell you in one hand, we promote it, and then they tell you on the other hand, here are all the hoops you're going to have to jump through in order to be able to use this easy method of procurement. You want to make sure that if you're piggybacking, that the initial buyer complied with all FTA requirements. Like I said, keep up to date on the 70% Buy America threshold. And I've said this several times now. Conducting a Buy America audit is not an easy task. It is very time consuming, and it may be outside the technical capacities of any of your staff members. When you lack that technical capacity, don't be afraid to go out and hire it. It is well worth the couple $1,000s you'll spend. In Pennsylvania, my understanding is you had a joint procurement that was led by South Central Transit Authority. They used an independent contractor to do the Buy America audit requirements. That was a best practice in my book. And of course, many of you are, if you're subject to the in-plant inspection requirement associated with the pre-award and post-delivery, many of us in the rural community and buying off a state contract are not subject to that, but oftentimes the state may go ahead and do the in-plant inspections for us. We want to make sure that we are aware of that activity as well. Incomplete procurement policies. There really is, unlike drug and alcohol, go to the FTA website, they have a template policy for drug and alcohol testing. There is no template procurement policy that I'm aware of. So this leaves it to your own devices to create a procurement policy that embraces all FTA requirements. And it gets a little more confusion again with 4220 being out of date and the added complexities imposed by 2 CFR 200, updated Buy America thresholds, and Congress outlawing purchase of surveillance equipment from Chinese manufacturers. There's always something. Again, stay plugged into FTA communication channels. You'll usually see advice coming out of state transit associations, attending meetings and the like. They'll generally have an FTA update session at every state transit conference I've ever been to. Those are excellent sessions to keep up with the changing landscape. As a reviewer, when we're evaluating the nature of your procurement policy, we paint by numbers. We're following a checklist. And we are by contract, not allowed to paint outside the lines. So we're looking for specific things in your purchasing policy. So sort of a hidden trick, and it's coming up in another slide, is there's something known as it used to be the triennial review manual. It's now referred to as the contractor's manual. Current version is the contractor's manual FY 2022. Chapter 9 relates to procurement. And question 1, I believe it is the adequacy of the recipient's procurement policy. We test you on whether or not certain provisions are addressed in your policy. And if we can't check that box, we inform the regional office, and the regional office makes a determination as to whether your policy is deficient or not. And that table of required elements is not widely published anywhere but the contractor's manual. So if you go to the FTA homepage, go to the search box and type in FY 22 contractor's manual, it should be the top hit. Go to section 9 and look at the indicators of compliance for question 1. And it will give you a table of what the reviewers are looking for. And when we introduced ourselves in the beginning, I asked some of the state DOTs to talk about their own subrecipient oversight processes. A lot of times the states will emulate the FTA process. So some of the questions in the state oversight process are going to be built on what's in that contractor's manual. Oftentimes the same vendors that the state are using are also FTA vendors. So there's a lot of similarity. And so you can achieve a high degree of policy compliance by looking at that resource. Oh, and every elected official wants to have a buy Smithfield, buy New York, buy Pennsylvania purchasing policy. I've got to tell you from a federal perspective, the procurement specialists in each of the regional offices in Region 3, it's Anthony Romero. He hates anything related to geographic preference. You don't really, that's fine for the municipal policy when the city needs to go out and buy paper, fine, buy locally. But do not put any language in your FTA procurement policy that says you're going to favor, award extra points, or do anything that favors a local vendor, because FTA views that as anti-competitive. And the overarching mantra in FTA procurement is maximum open competition. Oftentimes, you're going to go head to head on a less than cordial or collegial manner with your city procurement officer. Because if you really look at the range and scope and depth of FTA procurement regulations, it may be 60 pages compared to the municipal policy that's 12 pages, and your city procurement officer is going to tell you where to go. I'm not amending my 12-page policy by adding your 60 pages because it only deals with FTA procurement activities, and you're but 1/4 of our overall purchasing activity. I'm not going to have the tail wag the dog. And you're going to confront that sometimes. And that's a difficult hurdle to cross. What I typically recommend in this instance is you not try to fight City Hall, let the city policy stand, but adopt a supplemental FTA policy and add one sentence to the city policy that when federal funds are involved in this procurement, the city purchasing officer will work with the respective department head to ensure inclusion of all federal requirements that may be applicable to that procurement. You put that in the city policy, one line, you won't get a lot of kickback, and then you go ahead and develop your 50-page FTA policy. And so that may be one best practice to overcome institutional inertia at the local level. Incomplete written history documentation. So I asked you guys to suggest some things that should be in a written history. And I do want to point out these bullet point, what did I do?
Here, I'm gonna click the on.
Oh, I'll just point, the bullet point that starts the rationale for the method of procurement. Those are the 4 required elements that must be in your written history. And so a lot of times you guys throw everything but the kitchen sink into your written history file. Quite frankly, you overwhelm the compliance reviewer with material. I mean, an individual procurement, we download 5 files for triennial review. Each file may be 150 megabytes worth of information. That's a lot of data to go through in the course of the triennial review. It's somewhat overwhelming. But somewhere in the depth of that 150 megabytes, we have to look for, did the city of Smithville define why it used an RFP as opposed to an IFP? Because we're evaluating whether the conditions were in place to use that method versus the other formal method. If in fact you used micro purchase procedures, was it consistent with federal or local micro purchase procedures? If you use small purchase procedures, if your local policy says you must obtain 3 quotes, do we see the 3 quotations in the procurement file? And so we're looking for that. The selection of the contract type. Is it a cost reimbursement agreement? Is it a time and materials contract, which has many limitations associated with it? We're looking for those things that is the contract type appropriate. If it's an IFB, we're typically looking at a fixed price contract. And is the contract consistent with the method of procurement? And so why you used a fixed price contract on a professional services type agreement, that could be a question for follow-up review. But we want to see written documentation in the file that we use this type of contract because of this type of procurement and circumstance.
Is that written somewhere?
This is language that is in both 2 CFR 200. I might have the quote in my notes. It's in there. It's somewhere around 2 CFR 200.318. But don't quote me on that, but it's not far away.
But it's not in
It is also in 4220.
4220?
Yes. I've got to give FTA a lot of credit. Even before 2 CFR 200, FTA really was spot on in their procurement stuff. So even though 4220 is out of date, a lot of it is still consistent with 2 CFR 200, where other federal agencies were not. And so FTA didn't have to migrate an awful lot when 2 CFR 200 came out and became effective. A lot of other federal agencies had to move mountains to come into compliance. FTA, not so much. And some of the answers that you gave, other information necessary to establish the history of the procurement, you guys were spot on some of the other types of documents. Certainly the initial solicitation document, copies of the successful proposal or bid, the bid tabulation forms, required signed certifications, and the like would be other information necessary to establish the history of the procurement. And again, checklists. New York Dot mentioned checklists just a moment ago. I came up to help a client one day with a written history checklist and noticed that, and you might not be able to read it, there's a radio button. And the buttons are micro purchase, small purchase, and formal purchase. And then if you click on the formal purchase button, it opens another radio button series. And I have requests for qualifications, invitation for bid, and requests for proposals, three types of formal procurement activities. And once you click on that button, a new sheet appears and suggests the items that should be included in a written history. And this is just the world according to Rich type checklist. Checklists created by state DOTs or other things that you may find in best practice websites and the like. The use of checklists is highly recommended in procurement activity because it's so complex. Even the most senior skilled procurement officer is only human. They may forget something. I do. That's my checklist.
Oh,
I'm a forms geek, and I like to play with fillable Adobe Acrobat forms. But you'll see if you go to the last page on this, there's a disclaimer. This is the world according to the rich and may not necessarily represent the views of the Federal Transit Administration. Robbie Sarles makes me put that on all my checklists. But I'd be happy to share it with you. Might be a good starting point. You have a question?
Your 4 items, that's like included but not limited to, right?
Well, this is what must be in there. And in terms of my contractor's manual, we paint by the numbers. When I'm looking for completeness of the written history, through the 4 check boxes I'm in there. And then there's this one open-ended checkbox. Is there other information in the procurement file that leads you to conclude that there's a comprehensive history of the procurement? I check that box.
I would say that you want in there approval to solicit bids from your grantor,
You know,
approval to award.
yeah,
your
there's an
grantor.
awful lot of authorities in local procurement policy, depending on the dollar amount to be expended. So I must have the transit manager's approval on anything over 10K. If it's over 50K, I got to have the city manager's approval. If it's over 150K, it's got to be approved by the city council. If that was your scenario, then yeah, I would include all of those approval checklists in its own series of radio buttons or check boxes in my checklist form.
To me, I want to make sure I'm going to get reimbursed. So, well, that's what we do.
Yeah, I would want to be
So I want
reimbursed
to
too.
get approval to award by the grantor.
Excellent, yeah, and I would add those boxes to the form I developed for you, yeah. Absolutely. So I don't point this out to promote my own checklist. I'm sure there's probably errors of misspelling somewhere in there. But I use it to say this notion that we've heard repeatedly today about reliance on checklists is an excellent tool to achieve a higher degree of procurement compliance. And again, the form should be more than just radio button or check boxes. There needs to be a little narrative. So create a text field in there to allow for certain narrative that may justify the use of, say, a contract type. What was your rationale for selection of a fixed price contract versus another type of contract? Deficiency number 7, responsibility determination deficiencies. And we're seeing 2 types of deficiencies here. The first one relates to responsibility, and the second one relates to debarment. We touched on this one when we went over our top 10 list. But in terms of responsibility, embedded in transit law, and it's somewhat articulated because Congress didn't reinvent the wheel here. It's articulated in 2 CFR 200-318H. Your determination of vendor responsibility is more than just SAM.gov check. You've got to basically assess whether or not the firm has the ability to perform successfully, whether it's a contractor has some integrity, compliance with public policy, their record of past performance, and do they have the technical and financial resources to undertake the project. So if you wanted to design a bridge, you might like RLS and Associates. And you know, the economy may be rough, we're all hurting for business, and RLS may opt to bid on that project. But guess what? We're not qualified to design bridges. Our ability to perform successfully under the terms and conditions of your bridge specifications should result in a determination that we were not a responsible bidder. That's what that means. Contractor integrity. What's my record in the BBB Better Business Bureau website? Do I have a history of local zoning ordinance violations in my other construction projects? Have I been fined for non-compliance by municipalities at other job sites? Compliance with public policy is kind of along those same veins. Record of past performance. Almost everybody asks for references. That would be used as a basis to establish my record of past performance. But remember, we're all hungry as contractors, and we will only put our best foot forward. Every consultant contractor looks great on paper. We've got to do the extra digging to make sure that you uncover the skeletons in our closet, or else you may be unhappy with the performance that you get from that vendor, the performance of the contractor first.
How do you deal with bullet number one when it's not a concise scope, like building a bridge, where it's like, well, we want to do a particular study on transportation funds. That's no widget there that people fit in. There are several different types of companies that could fit us.
So Curtis is talking about an RFP that hit the street yesterday, I think. And so, and I actually read your RFP last night. Were the 7.5 hours I sat in Charlotte Airport waiting for another flight to get here. I got here about midnight last night. So if I'm a little off today, forgive me, it's a sleep deprivation. So how does one determine, so we'll use Curtis's example. The RFP basically wants to look at state practices in the dissemination of state funds to large urban, small urban, and rural areas. And they've kind of followed an established pattern for many years. And they want to re-examine that pattern to determine whether or not they're equitably or getting the most bang for their buck by using these percentage ratios, large urban, small urban, and rural. And so obviously they've got an RFP on the street. They're going to get many bids, many proposals on this. How do they evaluate whether or not the respondent has the ability to successfully perform? Well, believe it or not, other states have done the exact same thing you have done. Oregon, Indiana is probably the most comparable study that I've seen for what your scope of work is. So there are vendors out there, or there have been similar work, or if there's nothing quite similar to your needs, is it close? Who else has conducted work in state transit funding? And there have been just about every consulting firm has done at least one state funding study. So you should have adequate competition from an adequate number of consulting firms who will have qualifications in this area. So I think this will be an easy lift for South Carolina DOT to establish that criteria.
I guess what my concern is like you said, people are hungry. So you may have some who got a massive transportation experience, but really you're going after this.
And that's where it's not part of my presentation, but the evaluation of bids and proposals in particular, if you use the competitively negotiated method of procurement, AKA RFPs, you've got to have competent personnel on your evaluation committee. And sometimes the technical expertise of a particular procurement, you may only have 1 or 2 people within the organization who have a working knowledge of that subject area, yet you may want to have 5 people on your evaluation committee. And so what sometimes happens is you just fill the committee, and sometimes you put a county commissioner on the committee or a city council member on the committee. And my experience with those types of evaluation members is they lack the technical expertise to discern qualitative differences between proposals. And despite the fact that you said qualifications of personnel is 20%, related experience is 30%, if you can't discern the difference, the elected official will say, well, they all look good to me, let's just go with the low price because they're all going to be good. And you've basically thrown out your evaluation criteria, and price now has become the only factor used to make the award. you have violated federal procurement standards by following such an action. And it all emanated from the fact you put a non-qualified person on the committee to suck up to your elected governing board. So my advice is put qualified people in your evaluation committee. And I always like to use an odd number. 3 or 5 is ideal. In my book, 7 max. And if you cannot find enough qualified people within your organization, nothing says you can't use somebody from a neighboring community. I was involved in a procurement in Rochester, Minnesota, that ultimately that was protested. It was a 5-year operations contract. Last Row First Transit won the bid, and a local vendor who had held the contract for 29 years protested. It went to the Minnesota Supreme Court. And one of their factors in the court case, the party that sued, was that the city violated its procurement policies and had non-qualified members on the evaluation committee. That was not correct. We specifically had trans professionals, and there weren't enough in the city. We went out and borrowed state DOT personnel and municipal officials from other jurisdictions who had previous experience in seeking management services for their transit system. So don't be afraid to go outside the organization to get qualified personnel to serve on these evaluation committees, and that will enhance your ability to document as you evaluate the respondent's ability to successfully carry out your procurement. Now, the other side of responsibility is ensuring that they're not debarred. FTA gives you 3 options for doing this. Option number 1 is checking sam.gov. But if you don't want to check sam.gov, you can put a certification in your solicitation documents. By submitting this proposal, by submitting this bid, your firm hereby certifies that we are not presently debarred or otherwise excluded from participating in federally assisted contracts. Signed, John Doe, make them dated. FTA will accept that as validation that you've established responsibility, self-certification. And FTA will also permit you to include a clause in your solicitation document that says, if you are currently or presently debarred, you are ineligible to submit a bid or proposal on this contract. And if you put that clause in your solicitation document, put that in the contract, FTA will accept that as valid response on your part to meeting the responsibility requirements. Now, it's everyone's opinion that sam.gov is by far and away the best of those 3 techniques. But in full disclosure, any one of them will not, if you do any one of those 3, it will not result in compliance deficiency. My personal recommendation when asked, sam.gov in combination with the certification. I like to use 2 rather than 1 of those 3 available methods. Because someone can forge a certification, or they may be debarred. That company went out of business, and the next thing you know, it's like whack-a-mole. They popped up the very next day with a new name, new corporate ID, yet all the principals were involved in the department of the old firm. Typically, you see this in New York. And this gives me extra assurance that I've done my due diligence, because if in fact you go with route number 2, you get a certification, and you've evaluated and you can find no evidence that the certification was falsified, FTA does not hold you accountable. So that will not be a compliance deficiency. FTA only says if you discover that a certification that you received was in error or fraudulently supplied, you're not held accountable, but we do want you to notify the FTA regional office immediately. And it won't be a compliance dig on your part, but you do want to notify FTA, so because the OIG will go after that firm. Is there anything wrong with adding all 3 steps? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So the one thing that I would encourage you to do is responsibility isn't determined after proposals and bids are received. It's something that should be embedded in the solicitation documents. And again, responsibility checklists, those exist. I've made a few myself, where we can document reference checks. We can document, it's not uncommon, for example, to ask for the most recent audit report or independent financial statements of the contractors you're dealing with. And why would you do that? Because you're trying to get a better understanding of the financial wherewithal of the vendor to undertake your project. We are FTA funded. We're all cost reimbursement. That means the vendor may have to output tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And if it's a rail project, maybe even millions of dollars before they get reimbursed from us, because that's the way the grant works. And they've got to have the wherewithal to be able to undertake that initial outlay, because we don't do advanced payments typically. So financial responsibility and checklists, once again, are a useful tool to ensure that you have a valid responsibility checklist. And again, I think SAM.gov is the gold standard, and I personally like to combine SAM.gov with vendor certifications and the like. Lobbying certifications, whether it's a subrecipient or a contractor, if the value of that lower tier arrangement is in excess of $100,000, you are obligated to get a certification from that vendor that they do not spend money on certain types of lobbying activity. And a lot of times we get this, I see it getting a fairly high degree of compliance with contracts, not so much with subrecipients. And it's not so much state dots. State dots tend to do this, but it's when urban recipients have subrecipients. So for example, out in Davis, California, those of you who like wine know that the Davis is kind of the heart of one of the leading university wine viticultural programs, UC Davis. UC Davis is a subrecipient of the city of Davis. And they operate the fixed route, City of Davis operates paratransit. Well, the university has a fleet of 40 vehicles and the city has a fleet of 3 vehicles. But the city is the recipient. The university is the subrecipient. The city never thought to get a lobbying certification from the university, resulted in a compliance deficiency. And the lobbying certification is at 100K. So again, best practice. If your independent cost estimates indicates that the value of this procurement is going to be over 100K, add the certification to the solicitation documents. The other thing you want to be careful of is if it's a construction contract where we typically will have a general contractor and subcontractors, maybe an HVAC subcontractor, site preparation contractor, subcontractor. It is the responsibility of the prime contractor to get those certifications if those subcontracts are over 100K. And the responsible party for obtaining the certification is the next highest tier. So if it's a state dot and a subrecipient of 5311, the state dot obtains the certification. If it's a 5311 subrecipient and a construction contractor, then it's the subrecipient gets the certification from the contractor. And that's where it resides. If it's a contractor using a subcontractor, the subcontract's over $100,000. Subcontractor signs the certification, gives it to the prime contractor, and it stays on file with the prime contractor. So it only goes up, bumps up one tier. The next tier above is responsible for having that certification in the procurement file. Lack of justification for sole source procurements. What we typically see is that local procurement policies are more permissive than federal requirements for allowable sole source. So in a recent triennial review, I saw a procurement policy at the municipal level that basically gave the city manager unilateral authority to make a sole source procurement if he felt it was in the best interest of the city. That is not consistent with federal requirements. This recipient followed city policy, made a sole source procurement. I dinged him on it. Did not meet one of the conditions of sole source procurements in, and here's our citation, 200.320, and the 4 conditions are in subparagraphs 1 through 4. And there are legitimate, I don't want to lolly here, sole source procurements. There are legitimate circumstances where sole source is appropriate, particularly in technology acquisitions. And we've done stepwise implementation, perhaps stage 1. We went out and got automated scheduling and dispatching software for our demand response or our complementary paratransit operation. And then maybe in stage 2 with a grant we got 2 years later, we wanted to elevate our scheduling dispatching software with perhaps a real-time phone app. And we needed to have interoperability and an interface with the scheduling software with this phone app. And generally, most of the automated scheduling and dispatch software companies will offer that functionality. And while we could put that out and have multiple vendors, you know, will route match bid on something where Trapeze has the scheduling contract and route match knows that? Probably not. It's a situation where there are competitive vendors in the marketplace, but will they want to get involved? And is the cost of route match coming up to speed with the ITS architecture of the Trapeze software platform in order to affect that interface? Is that going to be a cost-effective proposition? Will that make route match a cost-competitive vendor for that procurement? Likely no. And so what you'll end up doing is saying, yeah, there's probably 8 firms that offer this type of mobile device application, but really only our scheduling software vendors will likely bidder because no one else is going to want to cross over and deal with intellectual property issues. And so you'll deem that competition would not be adequate in that procurement, and that would give you the justification for going sole source. But just unilaterally giving the authority to the city manager is not a wise idea. So the key thing that you need to be aware of in a sole source documentation is there's something in the written history file that directly nails one of those 4 conditions in 2 CFR 200-320. That's the key.
In your scenario with Trapeze and the other guy, it's actually a single bid, which is different than sole source.
Yeah, there is a difference.
So single bid, okay.
Yeah, there is a difference between, and sometimes people don't understand this. There's a difference between a sole source procurement where you know from the outset that likely only one firm will bid. We will not have a competitive procurement. And so we know we're only going to be dealing with one vendor from the get-go. That's kind of the sole source scenario. A single bid scenario is that we go out the bid, we anticipate multiple vendors responding, but despite our best efforts to have an open specification, when we opened, we got past our Friday at 5 o'clock deadline, there was only one envelope in the box, and it was from one firm. That's a single bid situation. When we have a single bid situation, you've got to revert to your own procurement policy. If you're in the state of Illinois and you bid and you're a single bidder, they will not award the contract, period. They'll go back and try to retool the specifications. They'll go out to bid again. But that's not required federally. What's required from the FTA perspective in a single bid procurement is you have to do some due diligence. And identify after the bid deadline, what were the factors that could have been present that resulted in us receiving only a single bid or proposal when we anticipated competition. I've conducted such analyses and I've heard all kinds of analysis. What it entails is you've got to reach out to those vendors. You call them up. Why didn't you bid? You were on our vendors list. You expressed interest in getting a copy of the RFP, but we didn't get a proposal from you. What happened? And I've heard all kinds of things. Well, your delivery schedule was too tight for us because we're really busy right now. Marketplace is jumping, and we just didn't think we had the staff resources to gear up to meet your delivery deadline. In another case, our proposal writer was on maternity leave and no one else wanted to write the proposal, so we didn't submit. Those are all factors beyond the buyer's control. In that circumstance, you may award a contract in a single bid situation, as long as you've done your due diligence and you've done the cost analysis, because competition was lacking, one of the triggering factors for a cost analysis. And if you're comfortable that the cost provided by that single bid was reasonable, you award the contract. If, however, in your due diligence, you reach out to a vendor who did not bid, and he said, yeah, I didn't bid, because go to page 32 of your RFP, it said you must use a number 8 widget in the development of the chassis. And you know, it's widely known that ABC only uses number 14 widgets, and you would not grant an approved equal status for that specification. Therefore, we didn't bid because you had a restrictive specification. In that circumstance, the prudent action would be to nullify the procurement, retool the specification, go out to bid, and hope for more competition. So in other words, it comes down to a decision. Was it factors within our control that caused the lack of competition, in which case the best prudent course of action is to cancel the procurement, restart over, and fix the restrictive element of your solicitation. But if it was factors beyond your control, as long as you can justify the price through cost analysis, award the contract to a single bid if your procurement policy permits. Oh yeah, absolutely. In a single bid, we look for telephone contact records. I talked to Mary Smith at ABC Manufacturing on July 9th, and she said that their proposal writer was out on vacation. I want to see those notes to the file. Or if I don't see them, I'll ask, the reviewer should ask, do you have any documentation of your due diligence on a single bid situation? And it may not be, you may not think to put that in the written history file, but it exists, and you provide that to the reviewer while the reviewer's on site. Or if it's a remote review, you upload that for the reviewer's review. And that normally then would negate the failure to follow single bid evaluation procedures, which would be a deficiency.
Well, written sole source justification. Back in the day, you used to have to send it to FTA. But
You do not have to do that anymore.
suggesting bring up the sole source justification.
Absolutely.
So that's the justification.
Right. And just to amplify, just make sure that sole source justification touches on those 4 things. That's the key element there. The audits aren't in the procurement file for pre-award and post-delivery. We've kind of covered that. There are certifications in there of audits, and that's why FTA has separated them into separate issues. I've kind of talked about them, I bundle them. But the key thing, and this is why what makes the audit process, particularly as it relates to Buy America, very complex. It's that detailed listing from the manufacturer of all components and subcomponents. And then you've got to establish the final assembly location. And you want to know what was done at the final assembly location and what may have been done at remote out of non-domestic locations. And you want to actually isolate the total cost of final assembly. And for Buy America purposes, again, our current percentage is 70%. And again, I've said third-party expertise is highly recommended in this area. And then Buy America certification, having that signed certification, it should go out with the solicitation documents. And then at the end, after final assembly and in conjunction with vehicle delivery, the required component and subcomponent list necessary to verify that 70% domestic content exists. And again, ensuring that this is a box in your checklist and is not overlooked in the evaluation process. Insufficient oversight of subrecipients, primarily, as I mentioned, a state dot responsibility, but it also can occur with some subrecipients. And generally, it's not necessarily procurement oversight is lacking with subrecipients. Generally, when we see lacking subrecipient oversight, it covers more ground than just procurement. It's financial management, it's procurement, it's civil rights. Generally, where there's smoke, there's fire. It's just not going to be a procurement deficiency. And again, some of the best practices here, at least as it relates to procurement, every recipient probably ought to have the subrecipient's procurement policies in writing and has conducted some critical evaluation of the adequacy of those policies. Assessment of risk. I think one of our state DOT individuals talked about assessing risk in the procurement actions of its subrecipients, and that triggers perhaps a lower level or a higher level of oversight review. That's an excellent process. Or establishing thresholds. You know, we don't necessarily need to look at every paperclip purchase of every subrecipient that a state DOT has, but over a certain threshold, higher risk procurements, maybe we ought to institute, say, such as Illinois DOT does, a pre-bid and a pre-award concurrence process. We're going to want to look at your IFB or your RFP before it's submitted or advertised, just to make sure you've got all the requisite clauses in there. Or prior to making award, we want to make sure you're making award if it's a bid to the low responsible bidder, or if it's an RFP, that the documentation you've submitted supports the selection of that contractor. And Illinois does that. That represents, in my mind, a best practice. And practice that some of you defined for us, instituting periodic reviews, be it annually, be it every 2 years, every 3 years, such as emulates the triennial review process. That is also an excellent process, whether you're a state DOT or a designated recipient with subrecipients. Conduct of those things is recommended. So I've got 10 minutes here and just a couple other things in closing because we're scheduled to quit at 12:15. I always like to be on time. I've found it very crucial to session evaluation tools that if you keep a group from lunch, your evaluation scores are going to just be a crapper. It's terrible. So I will never keep anybody long. But a couple other procurement issues. Incomplete standards of conduct. Organizational conflicts of interest. Failure to evaluate options. Exercising sound business judgment and establishing the period of performance under a contract. Use of qualification-based methods exclusively designed for use in A&E, but you use it to hire your auditors. FTA doesn't like that. Failure to communicate bid protest procedures to prospective vendors who may want to protest your actions in a procurement. So incomplete standards of conduct. Typically, the problem here is that your governmental organizations, you adopt ethics policies or COI, conflict of interest policies, but who they apply to? Your employees. If you read 2 CFR 200, your standards of conduct applies to any employee engaged in procurement activity, any elected or governing board member who may be tasked with approval of procurement actions, any officers or agents you may employ. Maybe it's an IT procurement, and you went out and hired somebody to help you write the specifications. They become your agent. They are subject to your standards of conduct policy. And what we see is that, and any of their immediate family members are subject to federal standards of conduct issues. And FTA and 2 CFR 200 are absolutely in sync on this requirement. And what we see is that your policies only cover employees and not these other covered entities. That's a deficiency. Also, your policy must address acceptance of gifts. And what happens if there's a violation of that policy? And generally, because these violations can represent isolated small instances of no consequence, up to including termination, I like to see violation clauses in your ethics policy that reflect this wide range of potential outcomes. And so that it gives a delegated authority, such as a city manager or county executive, the option to either dismiss the violation as inconsequential or may include actions up to and including termination in the event that an employee was found to be in cahoots and fed privileged information to a vendor that gave that vendor an inherent advantage. That would be a termination offense in my book, violation of our ethics conduct. I'm going to skip through these so that I can just touch on a couple of things here. Unfair competitive advantage. One of the things we see, particularly rural areas of facility design, we don't have a lot of facility design expertise in-house on our staff. And so we go out and hire a local architectural firm. Is what size building do we need? How much square footage of admin space versus maintenance space versus the size of the property we need to acquire? And the architect helps us out, writes us up a little report. Then we go ahead and submit a grant. We get the funding, and then we go out to bid for A&E services. Guess what? That initial A&E firm that did that preliminary feasibility analysis for you is disqualified from bidding on the A&E work because that represents an organizational conflict of interest. That first architectural firm has insights to your needs that gives him a competitive leg up on the competition. That is a classic organizational conflict of interest that is prohibited in federal procurement activity. So we need to be aware of these things. Anybody who writes a specification for you, almost by definition, is excluded from bidding on that contract. And that's the point we want to make on that one. Options. Options are because grants are limited. We may have a need to replace 20 vehicles, but the state only gave us enough money in this grant to replace 5. But we know they've kind of told us, come back in next year, we'll give you money for 10 more. But when we go out to bid, we've only got cash in the bank for 5. We don't want to do 2 separate procurements. So we'll go out to bid to procure 5 vehicles within the next 12 months, and we will elect to have an option to procure up to 10 more vehicles within a 2-year time frame. If you've included options in a vehicle contract or any contract, the basis for vendor selection in the price analysis or the price evaluation and the considering offers must include options. If you've built options into the contract, it becomes part of the price evaluation process. That's the thing we want you to know on that one. Oh, it's absolutely do, and it is it's probably the single smartest thing a small agency can do, because we oftentimes have capital needs well in excess of available cash, but that cash replenishes itself with each grant cycle. And so rather than conduct 5 procurements, we can go out and use options and maybe establish a maximum 5-year contract for rolling stock procurements. And that gives us the option to continue to buy. Now, the bid price of a year 2 bus versus a year 4 bus might be different to reflect inflation and market conditions. That's okay. But as long as we evaluated it all at the initial award, not just the price on year 1 buses, we are in good standing with FTA. Reasonable period of performance. It used to be FTA cap. No contract can be longer than 5 years. Congress did away with that stipulation, but there is a legacy element. Contracts for rolling stock and replacement parts for buses, we cannot go more than 5 years. On rail, it's 7 years. Anything else, our obligation is to use sound business judgment in establishing the period of performance under that contract. Again, procurement is expensive. If we're happy with the performance of a vendor, why not have a 7-year contract instead of a 5-year contract? That's really up to you. I like purchase options that establish some initial period. If it's going to be a multi-year contract, I like 3 years with 2 one-year renewal options. And you could make that 7 years if you'd like. But at some point, you just can't continue to extend the period of performance year in, year out, which sometimes happens. You're happy with the contractor. You don't want to go through the time, trouble, and expense of another bid. So you just extend the contract. I went into that Minnesota situation. That's exactly what they did. The same contractor had the contract for 29 years, only bid on it once back in 1979. Needless to say, a triennial reviewer, it wasn't me, had a lot of issues with that and forced the city to go out to bid. And the incumbent local vendor raised holy hell. Curiously, just as an aside, this was First Transit, you'll appreciate this. First Transit won the bid, 5-year contract. The legal manipulations from the resulting bid protest and lawsuit went on for 7 years. And finally, in year 6, the judge looked at the plaintiffs and said, what do you want me to do? The contract was awarded to First Transit. The contract's already over. They're in another 5-year cycle. What do you want? What relief can I give you? Anyway, sound business judgment in establishing the period of performance. Don't use Brooks Act procedures for anything but A&E and related transactions. Anything that directly is associated with construction, alteration, or repair of real property. When you need that type of service, that architectural engineering design type service, we don't pick our architect based on price. We rank order the firms based on qualifications. Then and only then do we enter into negotiation with the top ranked firm only. And if we're successful, we sign a contract with that firm. We send Dear John letters to the other firms who bid. If we're unsuccessful in negotiating a contract with that top ranked offer, we throw him out. He's done, he's dead. We go to firm number 2. We start the contract negotiation process, price negotiation process all over again. People liked that idea, and they started hiring auditors and transit planning firms using these same Brooks Act procedures. And FTA wants to be clear, this is uniquely associated only with A&E Brooks Act permitted endeavors, not professional services as a whole. If you like this idea of evaluating qualifications apart from price on a professional services contract for your auditors, use a 2-step process instead. Have the vendors submit not one envelope with their proposal, but 2 envelopes, one with their technical proposal, one with their cost proposal. Open technical proposals, evaluate, rank order. Then and only then open the price proposals, combine the 2 factors, and evaluators are not unduly influenced by price in evaluating technical qualifications to perform the work. That's the recommendation there. Bid protests and contract disputes. 2 CFR 200 changed the landscape. It used to be you had to have a bid protest procedure. They would bid protest to the city manager would render a decision. If you didn't like the city manager's decision, you went ahead and submitted a protest to FTA. 2 CFR 200 says you, the non-federal entity, and you alone are responsible for the resolution of bid protests and contract disputes. FTA doesn't want to get involved in your procurement troubles. There's only limited circumstances where FTA will get involved, is if the vendor can claim you violated federal law or you did not follow your own bid protest procedures in the adjudication of that protest. They're the only time FTA will want to see your protest. Otherwise, you're responsible for handling it. So number 1, make sure your policies get FTA out of the protest business. And number two, make sure you communicate what your protest procedures are. Either put a link in your RFP or IFB, or go ahead and copy and paste the whole bid protest policy and embed it in your solicitation documents so the vendors know what their options are. And with that, that is my contact information. I get a lot of inquiries. Say pre-COVID, I used to travel a lot, so email was usually the best way to get in contact with me. I'm getting old. I don't like the airlines these days, so I don't travel as much as I used to. So my phone contact probably is in today's environment equally as sufficient. People from my workshops always contact me, and I always try to get back to you within 24 hours. I want to thank you for your diligence and attendance, your great questions today. I hope you found the session helpful. If you did, please let National RTAP